It is many years now since I sat beside Sherlock Holmes in the familiar rooms of Baker Street, and yet certain mornings remain unusually clear in my memory. They return to me without effort, as though the old fire were still burning in the grate, and the faint sound of London traffic could still be heard beyond the windows. Among these memories is the curious affair which became known to us as the case of the Three Gables. I had not seen Holmes for several days. During that interval, I had no idea what particular problem had occupied his remarkable mind. His work was sometimes like he could disappear into the restless life of London and emerge again with some strange problem already half solved. On other occasions, he would remain quietly in Baker Street, reading, smoking, and waiting for the next turn in the great machinery of crime and human weakness. On this particular morning, I found him in an unusually relaxed mood. The fire was burning steadily. I had settled myself into the familiar low armchair near the hearth, while Holmes rested opposite me, with his long legs drawn comfortably toward the warmth. His pipe was between his fingers, and a thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward toward the ceiling. There was something peaceful about the room. Outside, London is beginning another gray day. Carriages passed along the street, their wheels making a soft, regular sound upon the road. The city had not yet reached its full daily noise. For a few minutes, Baker Street seemed almost separated from the rest of London. Then our front door opened with extraordinary force. I had barely turned my head when a huge man entered the room. He was so large that my first impression was not of a visitor at all, but of some disturbance which had suddenly taken human form. He was dressed in a loud gray checked suit with a broad salmon-colored tie. His shoulders were massive, his face broad, and his dark eyes carried a threatening and restless expression. I had seen dangerous men before, both in my medical career and during my years with Holmes. This man was different. His size alone would have been enough to make an impression, but there was something in his manner which made the atmosphere of our comfortable sitting room change at once. He looked from me to Holmes. He wished to know which of us was Mr. Holmes. Holmes did not rise. Instead, he continued to sit in his chair with the same calm expression he had worn moments before. He lifted his pipe slightly and acknowledged the man. The visitor moved farther into the room. His purpose was soon clear. He had not come to ask Holmes for assistance. He had come to warn him away from a particular matter. The man spoke of keeping out of other people's business. He suggested that Holmes should leave certain affairs alone, especially those connected with Harrow. His tone was rough, and his manner was intended to frighten. Holmes listened with an almost curious interest. I watched my friend closely. I knew that expression of his. When another man might have been alarmed, Holmes often became more observant. Threats, in his experience, were pieces of information. A threatening visitor had come from somewhere, and therefore he could be followed backward to the person who had sent him. The stranger then displayed one of his enormous fists beneath Holmes's nose. It was an impressive object. Holmes examined it as calmly as though it were some unusual specimen brought to him for scientific inspection. His question about whether the hand had always been so large, or had reached its present size gradually, was so unexpected that I nearly smiled despite the tension in the room. I had also, however, placed my hand upon the poker. Holmes noticed this. Our visitor noticed it too. His manner became somewhat less confident. He repeated his warning. There was, he said, a friend interested in the Harrow district, and that friend did not intend to have Holmes interfering in his affairs. The warning carried an unmistakable suggestion of violence. Holmes, however, was not impressed. Instead, he began to identify the man. His name was Steve Dixie. Holmes knew something of him. He knew that Steve belonged to a rough criminal circle and that he had been involved in violent work. More importantly, Holmes knew of another man named Barney Stockdale who was connected with him. It was clear that Steve was not the real source of the threat. He was merely the hand. Holmes wanted to know who was directing that hand. The subject of a former killing was also mentioned, and Steve's confidence disappeared almost completely. Holmes had evidently been watching him and Barney Stockdale for some time. Soon the large man admitted that he had been sent to Baker Street to warn Holmes that his life would not be safe if he went toward Harrow. He could not, or would not, explain who stood above his immediate employer. Then, almost as quickly as he had entered, Steve Dixie departed. The door closed behind him. The room became quiet once more. Holmes calmly knocked the ashes from his pipe. I had been ready to defend him if the situation had become violent, but Holmes explained that there had been little real danger. Steve was a powerful man, but not a particularly intelligent one. He was accustomed to intimidation and violence, yet easily frightened when faced with someone who knew more about his past than he expected. Holmes was more interested in Barney Stockdale. Barney, he believed, was the sharper man. The two were accustomed to assaults, threats, and similar forms of dirty work. What interested Holmes was not the men themselves, but the person behind them. There had to be a reason for the effort being made to frighten him away from Harrow, and Holmes had just received a reason to investigate. He showed me a letter. It had come from a woman named Mary Maberly, who lived at a house called the Three Gables in Harrow Weald. She had written that a series of strange incidents had occurred around her home and that she greatly desired Holmes's advice. She mentioned that her late husband, Mortimer Maberly, had once been one of Holmes' early clients. There was nothing remarkable in the letter itself, yet Holmes had already connected it with the threatening visit. If someone was willing to send a large and violent man to Baker Street merely because Holmes had been asked to look into a matter, then the matter was almost certainly more serious than Maberly's simple letter suggested. Holmes proposed that we should go to Harrow Weald. I readily agreed. The journey from London was short. We'd traveled by railway and then continued by carriage. As London gradually disappeared behind us, the character of the countryside changed. Crowded streets gave way to quieter roads, open spaces, and houses standing farther apart. Eventually, we reached the Three Gables. The name was explained by the three small projections above the upper windows. They were not especially impressive, but they gave the house its curious title. The building itself was a brick and timber villa, standing upon a fairly large piece of land. Behind it was a grove of young pine trees. The place had an air of neglect and sadness, although the interior was much better furnished than its exterior appearance might have suggested. Mrs. Maberly received us herself. She was an elderly woman of refined appearance. There was nothing alarming about her manner. Indeed, she seemed almost the opposite of the sort of person one might expect to become involved in a matter serious enough to attract the attention of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes remembered her husband. Then Mrs. Maberly mentioned the name of her son, Douglas. I saw an immediate change in Holmes. He remembered the young man. Douglas Maberly had been one of those striking figures seemed to attract attention wherever they went. Holmes had known him slightly, but enough to remember him clearly. He had been attached to the diplomatic service in Rome and had possessed great energy and charm. Now he was dead. He had died in Rome only the previous month from pneumonia. The news cast a shadow over the room. Mrs. Maberly spoke of the difference between the young man Holmes remembered and the person her son had become before his death. Douglas had once been lively, confident, and full of life. Later, He had become withdrawn, bitter, and deeply unhappy. His mother believed that his heart had been broken. She did not immediately wish to dwell upon the cause. Holmes, however, understood that some emotional wound lay behind the change. The possibility of a woman naturally occurred to him. But that was not why Mrs. Maberly had asked him to come. She had another problem. For nearly 2 years she had lived quietly at the Three Gables. She had few dealings with her neighbors and had hoped to spend her later years in peace. Then, only a few days before our visit, an unusual house agent had appeared. He had told her that the house was exactly what a certain client wanted. The price, he said, was almost irrelevant. Mrs. Maberly found this strange. There were several houses for sale in the area, and some appeared equally suitable. Yet the mysterious client was prepared to pay more than she herself had originally paid for the property. She named a price £500 above what she had paid. The offer was accepted immediately. There was more. The supposed purchaser also wanted all the furniture. Maberly therefore named a substantial price for that as well. Again, it was accepted without hesitation. She had always dreamed of traveling, as such a profitable sale would give her the freedom to do so. But then the lawyer intervened. The agreement brought to her by the agent contained a most unusual condition. If she signed it, she would apparently be unable to remove anything from the house, even personal possessions. Her lawyer, Mr. Sutro of Harrow, had warned her against signing. The agent returned. Maberly tried to make it clear that she would sell the furniture, but she intended to keep her own clothes, jewelry, and private belongings. The answer had been firm. The mysterious purchaser wanted everything. Nothing was to leave the house without being examined. That condition had finally ended the proposed sale. As Mr. Maberly explained these events, I began to understand why Holmes had taken the matter seriously. There was no ordinary reason for such behavior. A wealthy person who wanted the house could simply have bought it. A collector who wanted particular furniture could have purchased the furniture. But this unknown person wanted the entire contents of the property and wanted control over what Mrs. Maberly might remove. That suggested that something inside the Three Gables was important, something which Mrs. Maberly herself did not know was important. At that moment Holmes raised his hand. He had heard something outside the room. His attention shifted toward the door. I did not yet know what he had noticed. The peaceful atmosphere of the house had begun to change, and before Maberly's story could continue, Holmes was already moving toward the source of the disturbance. Little did I know that his next observation would bring us one step closer to the hidden purpose behind the strange offer for the Three Gables. If you enjoy these quiet recollections of our adventures, you are always welcome to join me again for another Sherlock Holmes case. Holmes crossed the room with the quiet certainty which always marked his movements. When his attention had been caught by something unusual, he opened the door. There, just outside, stood a tall, gaunt woman who had apparently been approaching the room without making any effort to announce herself. Holmes caught her by the shoulder and brought her inside. She struggled against him for a moment, protesting loudly at being handled in such a fashion. Mrs. Maberly immediately recognized her as Susan, one of the women employed in the house. The interruption seemed almost absurd when compared with the serious story we had been hearing. Yet Holmes was not amused. He had been aware of Susan's presence for several minutes. She had been listening outside the room. That fact was important. Holmes had allowed her to remain there because he wished to hear what she might do after learning that Miss Maberly had sought his help. Susan tried to explain her presence as something innocent. She claimed that she had merely been coming to ask whether the visitors would remain for lunch. Holmes did not accept this explanation. His attention had already moved to another question. Had Mrs. Maberly told anyone that she intended to write to him? The answer was no. The letter had been posted by Susan. That small fact immediately changed the shape of the mystery. Someone had known that Holmes had been consulted. The information had traveled remarkably quickly. Holmes turned his attention toward Susan. His manner remained controlled, but his questions were precise. He wanted to know whether she had sent a message to anyone concerning her mistress's decision to seek his advice. Susan denied it, but Holmes had noticed something else. A few days earlier, Miss Maberly had seen Susan speaking with someone beyond the hedge. That person, Holmes suspected, had been Barney Stockdale. The connection with the threatening visitor at Baker Street was becoming clearer. Susan had some knowledge of the people who were interested in the Three Gables. She was reluctant to reveal it. Holmes tried a different approach. He offered her money for the name of the person behind Barney Stockdale. The sum was modest compared with the wealth which Holmes suspected lay somewhere above the gang. Susan refused. Her refusal was almost confirmation in itself. Holmes watched her expression carefully. There was a brief moment when she smiled at something he had said. From that small reaction, Holmes formed an important opinion. He no longer believed the person directing Barney to be a man. He suspected a wealthy woman. Susan, however, would say nothing more. She announced that she had had enough of the household and intended to leave. Mrs. Maberly was deeply troubled. It was difficult for her to accept that a servant whom she had trusted might have betrayed her confidence. Yet Holmes had already shown that the information about his involvement could not have traveled otherwise. Susan left the room in an angry state. The door closed. Holmes's manner changed immediately. The lightness he had shown while questioning the woman disappeared, and he began to examine the facts with the concentrated attention I knew so well. The speed of the enemy had impressed him. Maberly's letter had carried 10 o'clock evening postmark. Susan had somehow passed the information to Barney Stockdale. Barney had then obtained instructions from his employer. Before the following morning was over, Steve Dixie had appeared at Baker Street with a warning. The whole operation had been organized with remarkable speed. Someone was watching the situation very closely. Someone wanted Holmes kept away from the Three Gables. The question was why. Holmes turned his attention to the history of the house. He asked Maberly, who had occupied it before her. The answer was a retired sea captain named Ferguson. There was nothing particularly unusual known about the man. For a moment, Holmes considered the possibility that something valuable might have been hidden on the property by its former owner. Such things were uncommon, but not impossible. London had always contained people with strange habits and stranger ideas. Perhaps, Holmes reasoned, something had been buried. Perhaps some valuable object remained hidden within the property. But this theory had an obvious weakness. Why would anyone who knew about such an object care about the furniture? If the object were valuable enough to justify criminal activity, there would be no need to purchase the entire house and its contents. Holmes wondered whether Miss Maberly possessed some rare object without realizing its worth. A painting, an old manuscript, a valuable book, something inherited without proper knowledge of its importance. Miss Maberly could think of nothing of the kind. Her possessions were respectable, but ordinary. She mentioned an attractive Crown Derby tea service, but Holmes quickly dismissed the possibility that such a collection could explain the elaborate mystery. There was another possibility. The thing being sought might be something Mrs. Maberly did not even realize she possessed. That, in Holmes's view, was the most important point. The unknown buyer was not simply interested in the property. The buyer wanted something hidden among contents, and Miss Maberly would probably never have surrendered it willingly if she knew what it was. I agreed with Holmes's reasoning. The mystery had become more interesting. Maberly had lived in the house for nearly 2 years. During all that time, nobody had shown any special interest in her belongings. Then, within only a few days, an extraordinary offer had appeared. That timing could hardly be accidental. Something had changed. Something had recently come into the house. Holmes asked whether Mrs. Maberly had acquired anything new. She thought carefully. She had bought nothing of importance during the year. As far as she knew, nothing unusual had arrived. Holmes accepted the answer, but not without reservation. He preferred to wait for clearer evidence, rather than force a theory before the facts were ready. The situation at the Three Gables was now sufficiently serious that he advised Miss Maberly to take precautions. Her lawyer, Mr. Sutro, was a capable man, and Holmes suggested that he spend a night or two in the house. Mrs. Maberly was puzzled by the suggestion. Holmes could not say exactly what danger might come. That was precisely the difficulty. He knew that someone was willing to use intimidation. He knew that the household had been watched. He knew that the criminals had moved quickly, but he did not yet know what they were seeking. He therefore needed to discover the identity of the principal behind the operation. The supposed house agent left a name and occupation. He called himself Haynes Johnson, auctioneer and valuer. Holmes immediately suspected that the name would prove false. A genuine businessman had little reason to conceal his place of business. Holmes promised Mrs. Maberly that he had now taken up her case and would see it through. We prepared to leave. As we passed through the hall, Holmes's eyes wandered over the room. His attention settled upon several trunks and traveling cases stacked in a corner. The labels caught the light. One bore the name Milano. Another showed Lucerne. They had come from Italy. Mrs. Maberly explained that they belonged to Douglas. Holmes. He asked whether the trunks had been unpacked. They had not. They had arrived only the previous week. This was the fact Holmes had been waiting for. Until that moment, Mrs. Maberly had honestly believed that nothing new had entered the house. But Douglas's possessions had arrived from Italy only a few days earlier. The timing was striking. Her son had died in Rome. His belongings had been sent home. Those belongings had reached the Three Gables shortly before the strange offer for the house and the furniture. Holmes immediately considered the possibility that the missing object was somewhere among Douglas's effects. Mrs. Maberly could not imagine what it might be. Douglas had not been wealthy. He had lived upon his salary and a small annuity, yet Holmes was not concerned with the ordinary value of the possessions. A manuscript, for example, might be worthless to its owner and priceless to someone who desperately needed it. He advised Maberly to have the trunks carried upstairs to her bedroom and examined as soon as possible. She was to search their contents carefully. Holmes would return the following day to hear what she had discovered. The mystery had now acquired a much more definite shape. The strangers wanted something connected with Douglas Maberly, and they had begun their efforts almost immediately after his belongings arrived from Italy. Still, we had no proof. Holmes remained cautious. As we left the house, the quiet grounds seemed less peaceful than before. We passed through the hall and made our way outside. The hedge at the end of the lane was high enough to conceal anyone standing nearby. Holmes had scarcely reached it when a familiar figure appeared in the shadows. It was Steve Ixie. He had been waiting for us. The sight of him confirmed something Holmes had already suspected. The Three Gables was being watched. Steve's large figure stood partly hidden in the shade of the hedge. He was no longer as openly aggressive as he had been that morning at Baker Street. Holmes's hand moved toward his pocket. Steve noticed. For an instant, I wondered whether Holmes expected trouble. But my friend was not reaching for a weapon. He produced something far less threatening, his scent bottle. The little gesture amused him. Steve, however, was not in a mood for jokes. He had apparently thought over the earlier encounter at Baker Street. His confidence had diminished, and he now seemed more willing to cooperate. He repeated that he did not know who stood behind Barney Stockdale. Barney gave the orders. Steve followed them. That was all he knew. Holmes did not press him beyond what he could tell us. Instead, he gave him a clear warning. Mrs. Mebberley, the house, and everything beneath its roof were now under Holmes's protection. Steve understood. He had seen enough of Holmes to know that the warning was not an empty one. As we continued down the road, Holmes explained his reasoning. Steve was frightened of the consequences of his own activities. If he ever discovered who was truly directing the operation, Holmes believed that he might turn against his employer rather than risk his own safety. The conversation then moved to a man whom Holmes considered especially useful in matters of London gossip. His name was Langdale Pike. Pike was a strange and unusual figure. He was not a detective in the ordinary sense. He was something closer to a human record of London's private scandals. From his position in a James Street club, he gathered an extraordinary amount of information about society. Rumors, affairs, secrets, scandals, and private disputes seemed to flow toward him. He wrote for newspapers that catered to the public's appetite for gossip, and the information he collected gave him a remarkable knowledge of the hidden movements of London's fashionable world. Holmes had occasionally supplied Pike with information. At other times, he had received information in return. If the person behind the Three Gables was wealthy, socially important, and connected with Douglas Maberly, Langdale Pike might know something about her. Holmes intended to find out. I did not accompany him on that part of his investigation. He told me that he would see Pike and attempt to discover what lay behind the mysterious events at Harrow Weald. I returned to my own affairs and saw no more of Holmes that day, yet I could easily imagine a kind of work he was pursuing. Holmes never treated London as a single city. To him, it was a collection of overlapping worlds. There was the world of respectable society. There was the world of criminals. There were the clubs, the newspapers, the theaters, the servants, the businessmen, and the countless private relationships that connected them. Somewhere within that great network was the answer. The next morning I went to Baker Street. Holmes was already there. From his manner, I could see that he had learned something useful. But before we could discuss the result of his visit to Langdale Pike, an unpleasant development arrived. A telegram had been delivered. It came from Mr. Sutro. The message was brief. The Three Gables had been burgled during the night. The police were already there. Holmes listened as I read the telegram. The case had moved faster than even he had expected. The mysterious people behind the affair had finally acted. His earlier suggestion that Mrs. Maberly should have someone stay in the house had not been followed. She had not wished to trouble Miss Sutro. Now that decision had consequences. Holmes regretted that he had not insisted more strongly that I remain at the house to protect her. There was no time to dwell upon it. We immediately set out for Harrow Weald. As our journey carried us away from London, I found myself thinking of the quiet house we had visited the day before. It was difficult to imagine violence taking place there, yet facts were undeniable. Someone had been watching the house. Someone knew Holmes was involved. Someone had attempted to frighten him away, and during the night, while the household slept, intruders had entered. The mystery surrounding Douglas Maberly's luggage had now become the center of the case. I could not yet see how all the pieces fitted together. Holmes, however, appeared to have a much clearer idea. The strangest part of the affair was still ahead. When we reached the Three Gables, we found that the quiet household of the previous day had disappeared beneath a much different atmosphere. A small group of curious people had gathered near the garden gate. Constables were examining the windows and the flower beds. The presence of the police gave the property a strange official air. Inside we met two men. One was a gray-haired gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Sutro, Mrs. Maberly's lawyer. The other was a lively and confident police inspector. The inspector knew Holmes and appeared almost amused by his arrival. He regarded the case as an ordinary burglary. The police already had their suspicions. The gang of Barney Stockdale had been seen in the area. Steve Dixie was known to be associated with them. From the inspector's point of view, the matter seemed almost settled. But Holmes was not satisfied. He wanted to know what had actually been taken. The answer was surprisingly small. Mrs. Maberly had been chloroformed. The house had been entered. But nothing of obvious value appeared to be missing. That fact alone made the burglary unusual. Mrs. Maberly then entered the room. She looked pale and exhausted. The events of the night had clearly affected her. She admitted that Holmes had given her good advice. She had failed to arrange for protection. Sutro had not stayed in the house, and she had been left without anyone capable of guarding against an intruder. She explained what had happened as far as she could remember. The night had been quiet. Then she had become aware of chloroform being pressed over her face. After that, there was darkness. When she regained consciousness, she saw one man near her bed. Another was standing among Douglas's luggage. The trunks had been opened. Their contents had been scattered across the floor. The intruder appeared to have been searching specifically among her son's belongings. Mrs. Maberly had acted with surprising courage. She had risen from the bed and seized one of the men. For a moment, she had managed to hold him, but he was stronger. He broke free. There may have been a second blow or some other struggle, after which she remembered nothing. Her young maid, Mary, had heard the disturbance. She began calling for help from the window. That brought the police. By then, however, the burglars had escaped. Holmes listened carefully. The important detail was not that the house had been entered. It was what the intruders had searched. They had gone directly to Douglas's belongings. That strongly supported Holmes's earlier theory. Whatever the thieves wanted was connected with the young man's possessions, yet Mrs. Maberly remained certain that nothing valuable had been taken. There was, however, one object which had been left behind. During the struggle, she had managed to tear a sheet of paper from one of the men. It had been lying crumpled upon the floor. The paper was in Douglas's handwriting. The police inspector regarded it as of little importance. Holmes disagreed. He had long understood that small details could become important when the larger facts were not yet clear. The inspector produced the sheet from his notebook. It was only one page. At first glance, it seemed almost meaningless. The writing appeared to be part of some novel. The page began in the middle of a sentence. At the top was a number, 245. Holmes immediately noticed the implication. If this was page 245, where were the other 244 pages? The burglars had apparently taken the rest. The police inspector believed that they had simply grabbed whatever came to hand while searching. Holmes did not agree so easily. Why would criminals break into a house and risk so much simply to steal pages from a manuscript? The answer was becoming clearer. The pages were not valuable because of the paper. They were valuable because of what they contained. Holmes stood beside me near the window and examined the surviving fragment. I read it with him. The passage described a man who had suffered physical wounds, but was far more deeply hurt by the sight of a beautiful woman who seemed to take pleasure in his humiliation. The writer described a moment when love had changed into hatred. The passage was emotional and bitter. It ended with a declaration of revenge. Holmes read it carefully. Then he noticed something which the police inspector had overlooked. A grammatical point was small, but to Holmes it was revealing. The writer had begun by describing the hero in the third person. Then, at the most emotional moment, the language shifted suddenly into the first person. Holmes recognized what this meant. The author had become so deeply involved in his own story that he had imagined himself as the wounded hero. This was not simply fiction. It was personal. The manuscript was Douglas Maberly's story. The surviving page gave Holmes the first real glimpse into the secret that someone had tried so desperately to recover. At that moment, however, the inspector still regarded the document as worthless. Holmes said nothing more. He had learned enough. We were standing in the Three Gables, surrounded by policemen, broken furniture, scattered belongings, and the remains of a nighttime burglary. But Holmes's mind had already moved far beyond the room. The mysterious buyer, the servant who had betrayed Mrs. Maberly, the criminal gang, the threat at Baker Street, the trunks from Italy, Douglas's death. And now the manuscript. One by one, the separate pieces were beginning to form a single pattern. I did not yet know the name of the person at the center of that pattern. Holmes did. Or, at least, I soon discovered that he had reached a strong suspicion, and the person he intended to visit was not a criminal hiding in some dark corner of London. She belonged to a very different world. Before the day was over, we'd be sitting in one of the finest houses in the West End, facing a woman whose beauty, wealth, and influence were as remarkable as the secret she had been trying to conceal. We left the Three Gables with the mystery considerably narrower than it had been when we first arrived. The police were satisfied that they had encountered an ordinary burglary. Holmes was not. To the inspector, the scattered belongings and the missing pages could be explained by hurried thieves searching for anything that might be worth taking. To Holmes, the events had a very different meaning. The burglars had not wandered through the house at random. They had gone to Douglas Maberly's belongings. They had searched those belongings with purpose, and one of the pages they had carried away had contained a portion of a story written by Douglas himself. That story was no ordinary piece of fiction. Holmes had recognized the bitterness in its language. He had seen a sudden change from detached narration to personal confession. The manuscript had clearly been based upon something that had happened in Douglas's own life. I could not yet see where the manuscript would lead us. Holmes, however, had already begun to connect it with the woman he believed stood behind the entire affair. Before leaving the house, he asked Mrs. Maberly whether she still wished to travel. She had mentioned that dream when we first visited her. For years, she had wanted to see the world. The strange offer for her house had almost made that dream possible. Had the buyer not demanded such extraordinary control over the contents, she might already have accepted the money and begun her travels. Holmes now returned to that subject. He asked where she would like to go. Her answer was simple. She wanted to travel around the world. Holmes listened quietly. At the time, I thought this was merely a kind attempt to comfort a frightened and exhausted woman. I was mistaken. Holmes had already decided that Miss Maberly deserved more than protection from the people who had entered her home. He intended to make sure that the whole affair ended to her advantage. But first, He had another journey to make. As we returned towards central London, Holmes was unusually quiet. The streets gradually became busier. Carriage wheels rolled over the road. Foot passengers moved along the pavements. The familiar noise of the city surrounded us again, yet Holmes remained absorbed in thought. I had learned that silence from him often meant that several pieces of information were being arranged in his mind. At last, he turned to me. He asked whether I could now see the solution. I admitted that I could not. I understood that the woman behind the affair was probably responsible for the threats and the burglary. I understood that Douglas Maverley's manuscript was important, but I did not know the identity of the woman. Holmes told me, and we went over. Her name was Isadora Klein. The name meant something to me, though I knew far less about her than Holmes did. She was famous. She belonged to the highest circles of society and possessed enormous wealth. She was also celebrated for her beauty. Holmes described her as a woman of Spanish origin, descended from a powerful family associated with Pernambuco. She had married an elderly German sugar magnate named Klein. After his death, she had become one of the richest women in the world. Wealth gave her enormous freedom. She could move through society without difficulty. She could travel when she wished. She could choose her companions. And perhaps most importantly for our present case, she possessed the resources to employ other people to perform unpleasant tasks on her behalf. Holmes then explained the connection with Douglas Maberly. Douglas had been one of her lovers. It had apparently been more than a passing affair. Douglas was not the sort of man who could easily accept a relationship on another person's terms. He was proud, passionate, and deeply committed once his feelings were engaged. Isadora Klein, by contrast, was accustomed to controlling her own life. She had no intention of allowing a former lover to determine her future. There was another complication. She was believed to be preparing to marry the young Duke of Lomond. Such a marriage would be a major social event. The Duke was considerably younger than she was. That difference in age was one thing. A public scandal was another. If Douglas had written a manuscript describing their relationship, the danger was obvious. The manuscript could expose the affair. It could damage her reputation. It could threaten marriage. And if the manuscript was already in the hands of a publisher, she might never be able to control its publication. The clues now fitted together. Douglas had died in Italy. His possessions had been sent to his mother. Among those possessions was a manuscript. Someone knew of the manuscript. Someone feared what it contained. And shortly after the luggage reached the Three Gables, the mysterious offer for the house had appeared. When that failed, criminals had been sent into the house. Holmes had no longer any doubt that Isadora Klein was involved. But involvement was not yet the same thing as proof. We had to confront her. Our carriage carried us toward Grosvenor Square. The district was very different from the quiet roads surrounding the Three Gables. Here the houses were large and imposing. The streets reflected the wealth of the people who lived within them. The contrast seemed almost symbolic. At one end of our investigation stood Mrs. Maberly, an elderly widow living quietly in a modest house. At the other stood Isadora Klein, one of the richest women in Europe. Between them lay the manuscript of a dead young man. Holmes remained thoughtful. He knew that a direct accusation might fail. A person of Isadora Klein's position simply deny everything. Without evidence, she could turn the situation against us. Holmes therefore needed to approach her carefully. We arrived at one of the finest corner houses in the West End. A footman received our cards. He returned after a short interval and informed us that the lady was not at home. Holmes did not appear disappointed. He said that we would wait. The footman repeated that she was not at home. His manner suggested that the words were intended to end the matter. Holmes, however, had already decided otherwise. He took out his notebook. On a small piece of paper, He wrote a few words. Then he handed the message to the footman and asked that it be given directly to his mistress. I was curious about what he had written. The note contained only a brief suggestion. Holmes had indicated that the alternative was Scotland Yard. The effect was immediate. Within moments, the situation changed. The door was opened. We were admitted. The interior was extraordinary. I had visited many wealthy homes in the course of my medical work, but even I was struck by the grandeur of Isadora Klein's drawing room. It seemed almost unreal. The room was enormous, richly decorated, and arranged with a taste that suggested both wealth and deliberate theatrical effect. The electric lights were subdued. Small areas of color appeared through the half-darkness. Everything seemed designed to create an atmosphere of luxury. Then I saw the woman herself. She was tall and graceful. Her figure was still remarkably striking. Her face retained the beauty for which she had been famous, though there was a certain hardness beneath it. Her eyes were magnificent. They were dark and expressive, and at that moment they were fixed upon Holmes and me with unmistakable anger. She had received our message. She knew that Holmes had come because of the events surrounding Douglas Maberly, and she was not pleased. Holmes, however, was entirely calm. He did not waste time with unnecessary explanations. He made it clear that he believed she had been responsible for the attempts to frighten him away from the case. He referred indirectly to the people she had employed. Isadora denied any knowledge of such matters. Her manner was controlled. She was too experienced in society to lose her composure easily. Holmes then made his position clear. He had taken an interest in the case because someone had attempted to intimidate him. The intimidation had failed. Indeed, it had produced the opposite result. The more strongly someone tried to prevent Holmes from investigating a mystery, the more determined he became to understand it. That was one of the qualities which had so often carried us through difficult cases. Holmes told her that the threats had caused him to investigate the death of Douglas Maberly more closely. She continued to deny involvement. Holmes then turned away. He announced that if she would not speak honestly, he had no reason to remain. His next destination would be Scotland Yard. The threat was not an empty one. We had almost reached the door when something remarkable happened. The transformation was immediate. Isadora Klein had been cold and hostile. Now she became almost gentle. She followed Holmes and asked him to remain. She invited us to sit. She offered to speak frankly. It was a remarkable display of social skill. She had quickly understood something important about Holmes. He could not be easily intimidated, nor could he be bought in the ordinary way, but he possessed a strong sense of justice. She therefore tried another method. She appealed to his humanity. She suggested that he could understand the position of a woman whose future was threatened. Holmes did not allow himself to be distracted. He explained that although he was not a policeman, he represented justice as far as his abilities allowed. He would listen. Then he would decide what action to take. Isadora attempted to soften the matter. She suggested that it had perhaps been foolish to threaten a man as brave as Holmes. But Holmes saw the greater danger. She had entrusted her secret to criminals. Barney Stockdale and Susan were the only people, she claimed, who knew who employed them. She had taken care to conceal her identity from the rest. This explained why the criminals had behaved as they had. They had known what to do without knowing the complete story. Isadora had deliberately kept herself at a distance. She was accustomed to using other people while remaining personally protected. Holmes warned her that such people could become dangerous. Criminals who knew too much could eventually become blackmailers. They might reveal what they knew. They might demand more money. They might turn against the person who had employed them. Isadora appeared confident that this would not happen. She believed Barney and Susan were reliable. Holmes was less certain. He also knew that the police were already interested in a burglary. The gang could soon be arrested, yet Isadora remained confident that she herself would not be connected with the crime. Holmes then reached the central point. He wanted the manuscript returned. For the first time, Isadora reacted openly. She laughed. Then she walked toward the fireplace. There, among the ashes, lay the remains of something that had been burned. Holmes watched her carefully. She used the poker to disturb the ashes. The meaning was obvious. The manuscript had been destroyed. The pages Douglas had written were no longer available. Isadora burned them. The action was a mistake. Holmes knew it immediately. Until that moment, she might still have tried to deny that the manuscript existed. Now she had effectively admitted its existence and shown that she had taken deliberate steps to destroy it. The room became very quiet. The fire burned gently. The ashes lay scattered beneath the grate. Holmes' expression hardened. The beautiful and wealthy woman standing before us had finally revealed the extent of her desperation. She had wanted the manuscript badly enough to purchase a house. When that failed, she had sent criminals. When they could not recover it safely, she had allowed them to break into the house at night. And now she had destroyed the evidence. Holmes understood that she had gone too far. He told her as much. Isadora accused him of being harsh. Then, for the first time, she began to explain her side of the story. It was not an easy confession. She asked Holmes to see the situation from her point of view. Her entire future, she believed, was at risk. She had plans. She had a reputation. She had a forthcoming marriage. She believed that Douglas Maberly's manuscript could destroy everything. She admitted that her relationship with Douglas had been a mistake, but she did not regard herself as entirely responsible for what followed. She remembered him as a charming young man. She had cared for him, but she had never intended to marry him. Douglas had wanted marriage. That was where their interests had collided. He was not prepared to accept anything less. For Isadora, this was intolerable. She had expected the relationship to end. Douglas had not accepted the ending. His determination had become stronger. According to Isadora, he had refused to understand that what she had once given him did not mean that she must give him everything he wanted afterward. She described his persistence as unreasonable. Holmes listened. He did not interrupt. The important facts were already becoming clear. Douglas had been emotionally destroyed by the affair. His mother had seen the change in him. He had become bitter and withdrawn. He had carried the wound back to Italy, and then he had written. The manuscript was his answer. It was not merely a novel. It was a disguised account of what had happened. Isadora had become the villain of the story. Douglas had concealed the names, but the people involved could recognize themselves. That was the danger. A wealthy and famous woman could survive many private scandals, but a public story, published and widely read, could have consequences that money alone could not easily control. Isadora explained that Douglas had sent her a copy. He had apparently wanted her to know what he had written. There were 2 copies. One was intended for her. The other was intended for his publisher. This fact had terrified her. She had tried to discover whether the publisher had received the second copy. She learned that he had not. Then Douglas died. His death changed everything. As long as the second manuscript remained somewhere in existence, she could not feel safe. She knew that Douglas's belongings would eventually be sent to his mother. The manuscript could be among them. That was why the luggage from Italy mattered. That was why the strange interest in the Three Gables had appeared so suddenly. The mysterious house buyer had never truly cared about the house. The furniture had never been real prize. The entire purchase was an attempt to obtain Douglas's manuscript without openly revealing the reason. Holmes had solved that part of the mystery, but Isadora continued to defend herself. She had first tried to buy the house. She had offered Mrs. Maberly far more than the property was worth. She had offered to purchase everything. She had been willing to pay whatever was necessary. Only when that failed had she turned to criminals. She claimed that she had wanted to settle the matter honestly, but when money could not secure the manuscript, she had chosen force. Barney Stockdale and his associates were sent to the Three Gables. One of them had apparently entered the household in the guise of a servant. The arrangement had allowed them to learn about the house and its contents. Everything had been planned carefully, yet Holmes could see the contradiction in Isadora's story. She wanted to present herself as a woman protecting her future, but in doing so she had employed criminals, arranged intimidation, and caused a vulnerable elderly woman to be attacked in her own bedroom. The case had moved far beyond a private disagreement between former lovers. It had become a matter of justice. Still, Holmes was not a man who enjoyed punishment for its own sake. He was interested in the restoration of balance, and as he looked at Isadora Klein, I could see that he'd already begun considering another solution. The manuscript was gone. The criminals would eventually face the police. The truth was now known to Holmes and me. Mrs. Maberly had suffered because of a secret that was not hers. There remained only one question. What could be done to make matters right? Holmes leaned back slightly. The fire in the elegant drawing room had settled into a quiet glow. Outside, London continued its endless movement. Inside, the strange affair of the Three Gables was approaching its final stage. At that time, I did not yet understand what Holmes intended to demand from the wealthy woman before us. But I knew my friend well enough to recognize that he had already reached his decision. For some moments after Isadora Klein had finished speaking, none of us moved. The fire had burned low in the great grate, and the last pieces of the manuscript lay among the ashes. The room, with all its richness and beauty, seemed strangely quiet. I remember looking from the woman to Holmes and then back again. The mystery which had begun in a modest house at Harrow Weald had now led us into an entirely different world. There was no longer any doubt about the central facts. Douglas Maberly had loved Isadora Klein. He had wanted marriage. She had not intended to marry him. The relationship had ended badly. Douglas had written about it. And the manuscript had become a danger to the woman who feared that its publication might ruin her future. Holmes remained seated with his usual calmness. He had listened to Isadora's explanation, without sympathy showing upon his face, but neither had he interrupted her with anger. That was one of the qualities I had always admired in him. He could listen to an unpleasant truth without allowing his emotions to interfere with his judgment. Isadora had tried to present herself as a woman placed in an impossible position. She had admitted that she had treated Douglas harshly. She had admitted that men had been hired to drive him away. Yet she continued to regard the manuscript as the greater wrong. To her mind, Douglas had threatened her future by writing the story of their relationship. She considered herself justified in protecting her reputation. Holmes did not accept that argument. He reminded her, in his quiet manner, that the trouble had begun with her own actions. Douglas had not invented the relationship. He had not invented the humiliation which had followed. He had written his account of it. Whatever one thought of his bitterness, he had been entitled to tell his own story. Isadora had crossed another line when she sent men to intimidate him. The matter became still darker when those men were used against his mother. The old lady, the Three Gables, had known nothing of the affair. She had merely inherited her son's belongings. Yet, because she possessed manuscript, she had become the target of a criminal operation. Holmes understood this very clearly. His interest in the case had never been simply about a book. It was about the way in which wealth and influence could be used against an innocent person. I thought of Mrs. Maberly. She had appeared to us on our first visit. She had been dignified and trusting. She had been pleased by the possibility of selling her home at a good price and finally traveling. She had not understood why the buyer wanted everything. She had not known why her servant was secretly communicating with criminals. She had not known why a large man had been waiting near her garden. And she certainly had not imagined that her son's private writings had placed her in danger. The contrast between the two women was striking. One had great wealth and power. The other had little more than her home and the memories of her son. It was the wealthy woman who had been responsible for placing the other in danger. Holmes sat quietly for a time. Then he considered the practical question before us. The manuscript had been burned. Isadora had destroyed it in front of us. There was no longer a complete document for us to recover. Whatever Douglas had written had been reduced to ashes, but Holmes had already learned enough. He knew why the manuscript had been sought. He knew who had wanted it. He knew how the attempt had been made, and he knew that Isadora had admitted her connection with the criminals. The remaining question was, what should happen next? I had expected Holmes to insist upon going immediately to the police. He threatened to do so earlier. Indeed, Isadora herself had clearly feared that possibility. Yet Holmes did not immediately rise. Instead, he considered the matter from another direction. He had always possessed a strong sense of justice, but his justice was not mechanical. He did not simply punish every wrongdoer in the same manner. He examined circumstances. He considered the people involved. And he often looked for a solution which would repair the damage rather than merely satisfy the law. The situation at the Three Gables was particularly clear. Mrs. Maberly had suffered. She had been frightened in her own home. She had been attacked. Her son's belongings had been searched. Her house had become the center of a criminal investigation. And yet the person who had caused all this possessed enough money to make the loss almost meaningless to herself. Holmes therefore decided that the matter should be settled in a different fashion. He would, as he put it, make an arrangement. It was one of those occasions when I saw a less familiar side of my friend. Holmes had often been described as a cold and logical machine. That description was never entirely fair. He possessed compassion, though he rarely displayed it in sentimental ways. His compassion was often expressed through action. He wanted Miss Maberly to benefit from the situation. He knew that she had long dreamed of traveling. The strange offer for her house had reminded us of that fact. She had wanted to see the world. She had imagined herself free from the responsibilities of the Three Gables. Now Holmes intended to give her that freedom. He turned his attention to the question of money. How much would it cost to travel around the world in comfort? The question seemed almost absurd in the circumstances, yet Holmes asked it seriously. The answer was several £1,000s. 5,000, he calculated, should be enough for a first-class journey around the world. Isadora understood where he was going. Holmes wanted her to provide the money. It was not payment for the manuscript. The manuscript was gone, nor was it simply a fine. Rather, it was compensation for Mrs. Maberly. The old woman had been drawn into a dangerous affair because of Isadora's actions. Holmes intended that she should at least gain something positive from the ordeal. The sum he demanded was £5,000. Isadora was astonished. For a woman of her wealth, the amount was not ruinous, but the principle was important. She had tried to use money to buy the Three Gables and everything within it. She had tried force when money failed. Now Holmes was using the power of her wealth to repair some of the harm she had caused. He wanted her to provide a check for Mrs. Maberly. The arrangement would allow the elderly woman to leave the Three Gables and travel. It would turn a frightening episode into an opportunity she had long dreamed of. There was something almost poetic about it. The house which had become the center of such anxiety would no longer have the power to hold Mrs. Maberly. She could go. She could see the places she had only imagined, and she could do so with the knowledge that the person responsible for her troubles had paid for her escape. Holmes then gave Isadora a warning. It was brief, but I knew from his expression that he meant every word. She had been playing with dangerous things. She had employed men who were willing to use violence. She had allowed criminals to enter another person's home. She had trusted people whose loyalty could easily be purchased. Such methods could not be used forever without consequences. A person might possess enormous wealth and still find herself vulnerable. Money could buy houses. It could buy servants. It could buy silence for a time. But it could not guarantee safety. Criminals had their own interests. Secrets had a habit of escaping, and those who relied too heavily upon intimidation could eventually discover that the very people they employed had become a threat. Holmes understood this better than most men. He had spent years studying the criminal world. He knew that criminals were rarely loyal in the way respectable people imagined. They were loyal to money, fear, or immediate advantage. Fear's conditions changed. Loyalty could disappear. Isadora had attempted to keep her secret secure by using people who knew only part of it. That had worked for a while, but it had not worked against Holmes. His investigation had begun because a large and threatening man had entered Baker Street. The threat had led him to Harrow. Harrow had led him to Mrs. Maberly. Mrs. Maberly led him to Douglas's luggage. The luggage had led him to the manuscript. The manuscript had led him to Isadora Klein. The whole chain had been built from small observations. That was Holmes's great strength. He did not need a confession at the beginning. He needed only one fact, then another, then another. He allowed the evidence to accumulate until the truth became unavoidable. I had seen this many times during our years together, yet each case still had the power to surprise me. The Three Gables was no exception. At the beginning, I had thought the matter concerned a strange house sale. Then I had thought it concerned criminals. Later, I believed it might involve some hidden treasure. After the discovery of Douglas's trunks, I suspected something valuable had been brought from Italy. The manuscript finally showed us the true nature of the mystery. There had been no treasure in the ordinary sense. There had been a secret written in ink, a secret which one person wanted to destroy, and another had died before seeing it fully disappear. Holmes had understood the importance of the written word. Douglas had been a novelist. His emotions found their way into his writing. The surviving page had been enough to reveal that. The sudden change in grammar had shown Holmes that the story was personal. It was a small clue. Most people would have ignored it. Holmes did not. He noticed the change from the distant description of a character to the intimate voice of the wounded man himself. That tiny alteration revealed a writer's emotional involvement, and from there, Holmes could begin reconstructing the entire story. I thought of the fragment again. It had described a man whose love had turned into hatred. The words were bitter. They carried the pain of a proud man who believed he had been humiliated. The manuscript had apparently been Douglas's answer to that pain. Perhaps writing been the only way he could express what he had suffered. The tragedy was that the writing had survived him. His mother had received his belongings without knowing what they contained. Then the manuscript had suddenly become valuable, not because it was a great literary work, not because it contained some rare information about politics or history. Its value came from the danger it represented to Isadora Klein. That was enough. Holmes rose. The interview was effectively over. There was nothing more to gain from remaining in the room. Isadora had admitted enough. She had explained the affair. She had admitted employing the criminals. She had admitted that the manuscript was the object of the search. She had destroyed what remained. Now she had agreed to Holmes's demand. The matter had reached its natural conclusion. As we prepared to leave, I looked once more at the room. It was difficult to connect this elegant setting with the rough events which had brought us there. The polished furniture, the subdued lights, the luxurious surroundings. Everything spoke of security and privilege. Yet, behind that appearance had been fear. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear of losing a carefully constructed future. Holmes understood that fear. He also understood that Isadora's wealth had made her accustomed to solving problems through influence. The case had shown her that not every problem could be solved that way. Some problems required honesty, others required restraint, and some, once created, could not be erased simply by spending money. We left the house and returned to the London streets. The air outside seemed cooler. The noise of the city came back around us. Carriage wheels moved steadily over the road, and the great West End houses stood quietly behind their gates. For a time Holmes said nothing. I did not press him. There are moments after an investigation when silence is more pleasant than conversation. We had been through enough. The case had begun with an alarming visitor at Baker Street. It had carried us to a quiet house in Harrow. There we had found an elderly woman, a treacherous servant, and the belongings of a dead son. Then there had been the nighttime burglary. Finally, everything had led us to one of the richest women in London. It was a strange journey, yet perhaps the strangest aspect was that the solution depended upon something so ordinary. A piece of paper, a page from a book, a few lines of handwriting, a small change in grammar. These things had been enough to reveal the secret. That was Holmes. He had never required a dramatic clue when small one would do. As we traveled back toward Baker Street, I found myself thinking about Douglas Maberly. I had never known him well. Holmes had known him only slightly, yet his mother had given us a glimpse of the man he had been. Full of energy, full of confidence, a man who lived intensely. Then love had changed him. The failure of that relationship had affected him so deeply that his personality had altered. He became bitter, he became withdrawn, and finally he wrote his pain into a story. Perhaps it was not the wisest response, perhaps it was not the kindest, but it was human. Holmes understood human weakness better than most men, even when he appeared to judge it harshly. That was why he had not simply dismissed Douglas's manuscript as the work of a bitter lover. He had recognized the emotion behind it, and he had recognized the danger which the manuscript represented. The case also reminded me of something else. Wealth does not always bring peace. Isadora Klein possessed almost everything that society could offer. She had beauty, she had money, she had position, she had freedom. Yes, she had been frightened by the words of a dead man. The elderly Mrs. Maberly possessed far less, but Holmes's intervention had given her something which money alone might not have provided: a chance to begin again, a chance to travel, a chance to leave behind the house that had become associated with such unpleasant memories. And so, in the end, the Three Gables had ceased to be merely the name of a house. It became, in my memory, the beginning of a curious lesson. People often imagine that great mysteries are built from great secrets. In truth, they are often built from ordinary things. A servant speaking to someone beyond a hedge, a postmark on a letter, a trunk arriving from Italy, a page numbered 245, a change from one pronoun to another, a threatening visitor who knows more than he should. Holmes saw meaning in all of them. He never hurried to force a conclusion. He gathered the details. He compared them. He waited. Then, when the pattern was complete, he followed it to its source. That method had served him throughout his career. It had served him again at the Three Gables. And yet, as we returned to Baker Street, I could not help thinking that the case had been unusually fortunate in one respect. The danger had been real. Mrs. Mapperley had been attacked. The criminals had entered her bedroom. The manuscript been destroyed. But the elderly lady herself had survived. And through Holmes's intervention, she would receive the means to fulfill a dream she had carried for years. She would travel. She would see the world. The house, the servants, the strange buyer, and the frightening night would become memories. Perhaps that was the best ending we could have hoped for. There are cases in which justice arrives through the courts. There are others in which it comes through punishment, and there are rare occasions when justice takes a quieter form. The Three Gables belonged to the last kind. Holmes had not ignored the wrongdoing. He had simply chosen to repair what could be repaired. As the carriage moved through the London streets, the afternoon light began to fade. Gas lamps were appearing one by one. The city was entering its evening rhythm. I remember the gentle sound of the wheels and the steady movement of the traffic. For a few minutes, neither Holmes nor I spoke. There was no need. The mystery was been solved. The danger had passed. And somewhere behind us, in a grand house in the West End, a wealthy woman had learned that even great fortune could not place her beyond the reach of consequence. Little did I realize at the time how often I would remember that quiet journey back to Baker Street. For Holmes had once again demonstrated that the smallest detail, patiently observed, could open the door to an entire hidden world. There are some investigations which end with an arrest, a trial, or the recovery of stolen property. Others conclude more quietly, leaving behind no dramatic scene at which one can point and say that the mystery ended at precisely that moment. The affair of the Three Gables belonged to the latter kind. By the time Holmes and I had left the house of Isadora Klein, the essential truth was known. The hidden purpose behind the strange purchase of Mrs. Mapperley's home had been uncovered. The reason for the burglary had been established. The connection with Douglas Mapperley had become clear. Yet I have often thought that the most interesting part of the case was not the final discovery itself. It was the way in which Holmes had reached it. When I first heard the story of the proposed sale, I had naturally considered the matter from Mrs. Mapperley's point of view. She had been offered an unusually generous price. The furniture was wanted as well. The buyer seemed willing to pay almost anything. There was, at first sight, little reason for her to complain. Indeed, if the agreement had been ordinary, I doubt whether there would have been a case for Holmes at all. But Holmes had noticed the peculiar condition. Nothing was to leave the house without being examined. That single detail had disturbed him. It was too specific. A purchaser interested in a house usually wants the property itself. A purchaser interested in furniture wants particular pieces, but a purchaser who insists upon knowing what leaves the house is interested in the contents for another reason. That was the first quiet turning of the key. The second came with the speed of the information. Mrs. Mapperley had written to Holmes. The letter had been posted. Almost immediately, the people who wished him to stay away had learned of it. That meant someone close to the household was passing information outward. Holmes did not need to guess wildly. He looked for the person who could have known. Susan had posted the letter. Holmes watched her. He noticed the signs of nervousness. He noticed that she had been speaking with someone beyond the hedge. He connected that person with Barney Stockdale. Then came Steve Dixie. The enormous man had seemed at first like the most important figure in the matter. His size, his manner, and his threat made him memorable. But Holmes never allowed a threatening appearance to distract him from the question of authority. Steve could frighten people. He could carry out an order. He could use his fists. But he was not the person deciding what should happen. Holmes therefore looked past him. That habit had served us many times. The visible criminal is not always the person who matters most. Sometimes he is only the last link in a chain. And if one wishes to understand the chain, one must find the hand that holds it. I remember Holmes explaining something similar to me during the journey from Harrow. He had little interest in Steve's courage or lack of it. What mattered was that Steve had been sent. Someone had decided that Holmes should be frightened. Someone had chosen the method. Someone had known where Holmes could be found. The threat itself was therefore evidence. The fact that a threat had been made told Holmes that his investigation had already touched something sensitive. This was why the attempt to frighten him had failed so completely. The people behind it had intended to close the door. Instead, they had shown Holmes where the door was. There was another feature of the case, which I found especially characteristic of my friend. He was willing to abandon a theory as soon as the facts contradicted it. At first, he considered the possibility of something buried in the property. A retired sea captain had previously owned the house. It was not impossible that some valuable object might have been hidden there. Holmes did not laugh at the idea. He examined it. Then he asked the obvious question. If something had been buried, why should the mysterious purchaser also want the furniture? That weakness was enough to make him set the theory aside. He next considered whether Mrs. Maberly might possess something rare without knowing its value. Perhaps an old book, perhaps a painting, perhaps some unusual object inherited from another generation. Again, the facts did not fit. The mysterious buyer did not want one particular item. The buyer wanted everything. That was the clue. The object being sought was hidden among ordinary possessions. And Mrs. Maberly did not know that it was important. Then Holmes learned that Douglas's luggage had arrived from Italy. The timing changed everything. The trunks had been sitting in a hall. The labels showed their origin. They belonged to a dead young man whose mother had not yet examined them. There was no need for Holmes to invent a complicated theory. The simplest explanation was already before us. Something had arrived, something connected with Douglas, something that someone else desperately wanted. I remember the moment when Holmes's attention settled upon those trunks. It was one of those small moments which might easily be missed by an ordinary observer. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden discovery, only Holmes looking at luggage. But the luggage represented a new direction. The mystery was no longer buried in the walls of the Three Gables. It might be inside one of the trunks, and it was, not in the form of gold or jewels, not in the form of some rare object. It was contained in Douglas Maberly's writing. The surviving page was particularly revealing. I had read it as a piece of melodramatic fiction. Holmes read it differently. He saw the emotional structure beneath the words. The wounded man, the beautiful woman, the humiliation, the transformation of love into hatred, the promise of revenge. The passage was not subtle, but its importance did not lie in its literary quality. It lay in its personal nature. Holmes noticed the grammatical change. The writer had begun by describing the hero as though he were someone else. Then, at the most painful moment, he had begun speaking as the hero himself. That was enough for Holmes. Douglas had not merely invented a character, he had entered the story. He had written his own suffering into it. That discovery gave us the key to Isadora Klein. Once her name had entered the investigation, the other facts settled into place with remarkable ease. Her position explained the money. Her reputation explained the fear. Her connection with Douglas explained the manuscript. Her desire to protect her future explained the urgency. And her access to criminals explained the strange events at the Three Gables. What had seemed like several unrelated mysteries were really one. This was perhaps the part of Holmes's method which impressed me most. He did not merely solve individual clues. He looked for a single explanation capable of accounting for all of them. If a theory explained only one fact, it was weak. If it explained two, it became interesting. If it explained almost everything, then it deserved serious attention. The Three Gables offered precisely that sort of pattern. The strange house offer, the insistence upon the furniture, Susan's secret communication, Stidixie's warning, the surveillance, the arrival of Douglas's trunks, the burglary, the search of the luggage, the missing manuscript pages, the surviving fragment, the emotional change in the writing, and finally, Isadora Klein. Every part pointed toward the same center. I had sometimes wondered whether Holmes enjoyed such discoveries. He certainly enjoyed the intellectual process. But I do not think that he enjoyed the suffering that sometimes lay behind them. In the case of the Three Gables, there were no winners in the ordinary sense. Douglas was dead. His mother had been frightened and injured. Isadora had spent enormous sums and placed herself in danger in an attempt to suppress the past. The criminals had exposed themselves to the police. The manuscript had been destroyed, and yet, in another sense, something had been restored. Mrs. Maberly had been given the opportunity to leave the unpleasant circumstances surrounding her home. The money demanded by Holmes would allow her to fulfill the wish she had expressed so simply. She wanted to travel. I remember that detail because it seemed so innocent compared with the events surrounding it. When we first met her, she had spoken of traveling almost casually. She had imagined herself free to see other countries. It was an ordinary dream, yet it had become part of Holmes' solution. He had not forgotten it. That was another characteristic of my friend. While I often concentrated upon the central mystery, Holmes noticed small human details surrounding it. He remembered what people said. He remembered what they valued. He remembered their hopes. And when the opportunity arose, he could use those details in unexpected ways. The £5,000 he demanded from Isadora were not merely a punishment. They represented a change in circumstances for Mrs. Maberly. The woman who had caused her trouble possessed enough money to make the payment without hardship. Maberly, on the other hand, could use it to change her life. There was something almost gentle in the justice of that arrangement. The same wealth which had been used to purchase influence would now provide freedom for an innocent woman. It was not the sort of conclusion one would expect from a police report. But Holmes had never been limited to police reports. He dealt with human beings. Human beings are complicated. Their motives could not always be measured in simple legal terms. Their fears, desires, pride, jealousy, and affection often mattered just as much as the facts which appeared on paper. The case also taught me something about secrecy. A secret can seem safe when only one person knows it. It becomes less safe when two people know it. Less safe again when three people know it. Isadora had tried to control the secret by controlling everyone around her. She had concealed her identity from the criminals. She had used intermediaries. She had attempted to purchase the house. When that failed, she had used force. But every new step created another person who knew something. The secret became larger as she tried to make it smaller. That was the irony. Her efforts to protect herself had produced the trail which led Holmes to her. The criminals themselves had become clues. The servant had become a clue. The threats had become clues. The attempted burglary had become a clue. Even the destruction of the manuscript had become a clue. Isadora had tried to erase evidence. Instead, she had confirmed its importance. Holmes understood this perfectly. I have often noticed that criminals fear evidence. They imagine that evidence consists only of physical objects, a letter, a weapon, a fingerprint, a document. But Holmes knew that evidence could also exist in behavior. A person who reacts too strongly to a particular question reveals something. A person who suddenly changes their story reveals something. A person who destroys an object reveals something. A person who sends a warning reveals something. The absence of evidence can also be evidence, when something should logically have been present. That was why Holmes had been so interested in the unusual house agreement. It contained a condition which did not belong there. And because it did not belong there, it pointed toward the hidden purpose. The entire investigation had therefore grown from things which did not fit. That perhaps is one of the simplest lessons I learned from Holmes. When something appears slightly wrong, do not dismiss it merely because it is small. The smallest irregularity may be the edge of a much larger truth. A servant speaking privately beyond a hedge may mean nothing. A strange condition in the contract may mean nothing. A trunk arriving from abroad may mean nothing. A single page of writing may mean nothing. But when all those things appear together, they cease to be meaningless. They become a pattern. And Holmes was a master at recognizing patterns. By the time we had left Isadora Klein, I had begun to appreciate the case differently. I had entered it thinking that we were investigating an property sale. I had left knowing that we had been investigating the aftermath of a broken relationship. The house had been only the stage. The true story lay in the people. Douglas had loved. Isadora had refused. Douglas had suffered. He had written. Isadora had feared, and that fear had brought the matter to Holmes. It was a reminder that the roots of a mystery may lie far from the place where the mystery first appears. The Three Gables was not really about a house. It was about a past which someone desperately wanted to bury. Yet the past had arrived in a trunk from Italy, and once it had arrived, no amount of money could make Holmes ignore it. There are moments in a detective's career when he discovers the truth but gains little satisfaction from it. I believe this was one of those moments for Holmes. He had solved the puzzle, but solving it could not bring Douglas Maberly back. It could not undo the suffering he had endured. It could not erase the fear Mrs. Maberly had experienced. It could not restore the manuscript. All Holmes could do was see that the living were treated fairly. That was enough. As we traveled through London after leaving Isadora's house, evening was settling over the city. The great buildings had become darker against the fading sky. Gas lamps were beginning to shine along the streets. Carriages passed at intervals. The sound of wheels came and went, like the quiet rhythm of the city itself. I remember thinking how strange it was that London could continue so normally, while individual lives were changing so completely. Thousands of people were going home. Shopkeepers were closing their doors. Servants were lighting lamps. Families were preparing dinner. And yet, in one house, A woman had just learned that her carefully guarded secret had been discovered. In another, an elderly widow was preparing to leave behind the house where she had endured a frightening experience. The city knew nothing of it. London rarely did. That was one reason Holmes fascinated me. He seemed to possess an invisible map of the lives moving beneath the surface of the city. He knew that behind quiet doors there were stories. Behind respectable names there were secrets. Behind ordinary events there were motives. And sometimes, if one knew how to look, the smallest detail could open the door. The Three Gables had given us such a door. I had walked through it beside my friend. Now it was closing. The mystery had ended. The danger had passed. And the evening streets of London carried us quietly onward. There was nothing more for us to pursue. Only the memory remained. And memories, I have found, sometimes become clearer with age. Years later, when I thought of Sherlock Holmes, I remembered many of the great cases. There were crimes of greater danger. There were mysteries of greater complexity. There were villains more openly wicked. Yet the Three Gables remained memorable because it revealed something very human. It showed how love could become bitterness, how wealth could become fear, how fear could become violence, and how a few quiet observations could bring the truth into the light. For Holmes, the case was another demonstration of his method. For me, it was also a reminder that behind every mystery there are people, and people, unlike clues, are never simple. The fire in Baker Street would burn again on other nights. Other clients would come. Other mysteries would begin. But for that particular case, the great machinery of deduction had finally become still. The Three Gables had yielded its secret. And in the quiet that followed, I found myself grateful that the final result had brought at least some measure of freedom to the one person who had never deserved to be involved. May Burley had wanted to see the world. Now she could, and perhaps that was the gentlest conclusion which the strange affair could have offered. Little did I know, when we first entered that modest house in Harrow Weald, that a few trunks from Italy and a single page of writing would lead us through such a remarkable chain of events. But that was the way of Sherlock Holmes. The world might present him with a house. He would look for the secret inside it. It might present him with a threatening man. He would look for the person behind him. It might present him with a page of fiction. He would look for the life hidden inside the words. And when at last the pieces came together, he would sit quietly, as he had so often done beside the fire at Baker Street, and make the impossible appear simple. That, more than anything else, is how I remember him. There is a curious habit which comes with advancing years. When one has lived through enough events, the mind no longer remembers them in the order in which they occurred. Instead, certain details remain brighter than others. A face may stay with us when the conversation has faded. A particular room may return more clearly than the people who stood inside it. Sometimes it is no more than the sound of carriage wheels upon a quiet road, or the smell of a fire burning late in the evening. So it is with my memory of the Three Gables. I remember the house. I remember the trunks from Italy. I remember the strange fragment of Douglas Maberly's manuscript. And above all, I remember the extraordinary path by which Holmes moved from a threatening visitor in Baker Street to the wealthy and beautiful Isadora Klein. At the beginning, there seemed to be no connection between those things. That was the deceptive part of the affair. The first event was Steve Dixie. Had that large and intimidating man entered Baker Street on an ordinary morning, I might have regarded him simply as a troublesome criminal. Holmes did not. He looked beyond the threat. That was always his way. A man had appeared to warn him away from Harrow. Therefore, Holmes reasoned, something in Harrow was worth protecting. The warning had revealed its own importance. It was almost as though the unknown enemy had placed a sign upon the road and told Holmes not follow it. Naturally, my friend followed. I have often wondered whether those who attempted to frighten Holmes ever understood how completely they were helping him. A threat against an ordinary man may succeed. A threat against Sherlock Holmes usually became information. The more carefully the threat was arranged, the more Holmes wanted to know why. Steve Dixie himself was not the answer. Holmes quickly understood that. He belonged to a rough circle of men accustomed to intimidation. He was strong, but he was not the architect of the affair. There was a more intelligent person behind him. That person had remained hidden. At first, Holmes did not know whether the principal was a man or a woman. Susan Stockdale helped him narrow the possibilities. Her reaction when Holmes questioned her was more useful than anything she deliberately said. That was another lesson I learned from him. People often imagine that their words reveal what they know. In fact, their reactions can reveal far more. A hesitation, a smile, a sudden change of expression, a glance toward a door, a nervous movement of the hands. Holmes watched all these things. He had been watching Susan even before he confronted her. He had noticed that she had been listening. He had noticed that she had posted Mrs. Maberly's letter. He had learned that information about his involvement had reached Barney Stockdale almost immediately. The speed was extraordinary. A letter had been posted at 10 in the evening. By the next morning, Holmes had received his warning. Someone had acted quickly. Someone was watching. And someone possessed enough authority to set the criminal machinery in motion without delay. The mystery, therefore, had two separate levels. There were the people Holmes could see, and there was the person he could not yet see. Steve was visible. Barney was visible. Susan was visible. The unknown employer was hidden. Holmes was interested in the hidden figure. This was why he did not waste much time upon Steve's threats. He wanted to reach the source. Then came the house itself. The Three Gables was not an impressive building. Its name suggested more grandeur than its three small projections deserved. The property stood upon open ground, with a grove of young pines behind it. There was something slightly melancholy about the place, yet the house contained a secret. At first, we did not know whether that secret belonged to the property itself. The former owner had been a retired sea captain. Holmes briefly considered the possibility that something had been hidden there. It was a reasonable thought. Old houses often accumulate stories. Objects are forgotten. Documents disappear into cupboards. Valuable possessions may be concealed by people who later die without revealing their location. But Holmes did not remain attached to the idea. The furniture contradicted it. Why would someone who knew of hidden treasure want every piece of furniture as well? There was no satisfactory answer. So Holmes moved on. This was important. He did not defend his first theory simply because he had thought of it. He abandoned it when the facts failed to support it. I have known intelligent men who become prisoners of their own ideas. Holmes was different. He valued an accurate conclusion more than the pleasure of being right. Then came another possibility. Perhaps Mrs. Maberly possessed some valuable object without knowing it. An old painting, a rare book, some piece of furniture whose history had been forgotten. Again, nothing seemed to fit. The mysterious buyer did not merely want one object. The buyer wanted the house, the furniture, everything. That suggested that the sought-after object was hidden among ordinary things. But where? The answer appeared almost casually. In the hall stood Douglas Maberly's trunks. They had arrived from Italy. Mrs. Maberly had not yet examined them. That was the moment when the whole investigation shifted. I remember Holmes studying those cases. He did not need to open them himself. He only needed to notice their presence. Their labels gave him the important fact. They had come from Italy, they belonged to Douglas, and they had arrived only a short time before the mysterious interest in the Three Gables began. It was enough. The object had recently entered the house. That was the conclusion we have reached earlier. Now we knew when it had arrived. The mystery had acquired a date. That is often the point at which a case begins to become solvable. An unknown event is difficult to investigate. An event connected with a particular time is much easier. The trunks had arrived. Then the house agent had appeared. Then the threats had followed. The order was unmistakable. The luggage mattered. Holmes told Mrs. Maberly to examine it. The burglars reached the same conclusion before we did. Their arrival during the night was confirmation. They had not searched the house indiscriminately. They had gone to Douglas's belongings. That was why the burglary had been so revealing. The thieves had shown us exactly what they wanted. There was another important detail. They had not found what they sought. Maberly believed that nothing of value had been taken. If the burglars had carried away most of a manuscript, only a single page remained. It was page 245. Holmes immediately asked the obvious question. Where were the other pages? The inspector believed that the burglars had simply taken whatever they could find. But that explanation did not satisfy Holmes. The thieves had gone to the luggage. They had searched it. They had removed the manuscript. Therefore, the manuscript was the object. But why? That was the question. I remember looking at the surviving page. It seemed to me to be nothing more than a piece of melodramatic writing. The language was emotional. The wounded man looked upon the beautiful woman who had caused his suffering. Love became hatred. The writer spoke of revenge. There was nothing particularly unusual about the subject. Holmes, however, noticed the grammar. That tiny detail changed the entire meaning. The story began with the hero described from a distance. Then the writer suddenly became the hero. The voice changed. The man who had been described as another person was suddenly speaking for himself. Holmes recognized that the writer had become emotionally absorbed in his own creation. The story was not merely invented. It came from experience. Douglas Maberly had written himself into the manuscript. That discovery was quiet. No gun was fired. No door was broken. No dramatic confession occurred. Yet it was perhaps the most important moment in the entire investigation. A single pronoun had opened the way to the truth. From there, Holmes needed a name. Langdale Pike provided the bridge. I did not see all of Holmes's work during that period, but I knew enough of his methods to understand the value of Pike's knowledge. London society had its own hidden network. People who lived in fashionable houses were not necessarily isolated from the darker side of life. On the contrary, scandals traveled quickly. Broken engagements, private quarrels, secret relationships, money, jealousy, reputation. These things moved through society almost as rapidly as criminal rumors moved through the streets. Langdale Pike knew this world, and Holmes knew how to use that knowledge. The name that emerged was Isadora Klein. Once Holmes told me about her, the entire matter became much clearer. She had wealth beyond ordinary measure. She had beauty and social position. She had been connected with Douglas Maberly, and she was preparing for another important stage in her life, marriage. A manuscript describing her relationship with Douglas could therefore become extremely dangerous. The mystery was no longer mysterious. It had become a problem of motive. That distinction matters. A detective may know who committed an act without knowing why. But once motive is established, earlier events often take on new meaning. The strange purchase of the Three Gables now made sense. The demand for the furniture made sense. The insistence that nothing be removed without inspection made sense. The servant's betrayal made sense. The threats made sense. The burglary made sense. Everything pointed toward the same object, the manuscript. Behind the manuscript stood Isadora Klein. At the time, I was struck by the contrast between the world of Mayberley and the world of Isadora. The old widow lived quietly. Her possessions were respectable but ordinary. Her great desire was to travel. Isadora lived among wealth and luxury. Her problem was not whether she could afford something. Her problem was whether she could prevent something from becoming public. Both women were connected to Douglas, but in completely different ways. One had been his mother. The other had been his lover. One had inherited his possessions. The other feared what those possessions contained. That contrast gave the case much of its human character. Holmes understood that the real object of the criminal's search was not Mrs. Mayberley herself. She was merely in the way. That made the attack upon her especially unpleasant. She had done nothing. She had not known about the manuscript. She had not sought revenge. She had not threatened anyone. She had simply received her dead son's luggage, yet that was enough to place her in danger. Holmes could not ignore that. It was one reason why his final decision was different from what I had expected. He could have sent the matter directly to the police. Indeed, he had threatened to do so. Isadora had clearly feared that outcome, but Holmes saw another way. He could make the wealthy woman compensate the innocent one. The amount he selected was £5,000. It was enough to allow Mrs. Mayberley to travel in comfort. The old lady had spoken of seeing the world. Holmes had remembered. I sometimes think that this was one of the gentlest acts I ever saw him perform. He did not speak sentimentally. He did not comfort Mrs. Mayberley with elaborate words. He simply remembered what she wanted. Then he found a practical way to make it possible. That was Holmes's form of kindness. It was rarely dramatic. It was often hidden inside a solution. I have sometimes wondered what became of Mrs. Mayberley afterward. The original events give us no detailed account, but I like to imagine her leaving the Three Gables behind. Perhaps she stood upon a railway platform, with her luggage beside her. Perhaps she watched the English countryside pass from the window. Perhaps, after all the anxiety of those weeks, she finally experienced the freedom she had once described so quietly. There is comfort in imagining such an ending. The Three Gables had been associated with fear. It had been watched. Its rooms had been searched. Its mistress had been attacked. But it did not have to remain the place where her life ended emotionally. She could leave. She could travel. She could begin again. That was enough. As for Isadora Klein, Holmes's warning was perhaps more important than the money. He reminded her that people who work through criminals eventually place themselves in danger. The very men she employed might one day become a threat. The secrecy she depended upon could become a weakness. A criminal who knows one secret may want another. A criminal who knows the identity of a wealthy employer and may eventually understand the value of that knowledge. Holmes had seen this pattern many times. The use of force creates fear. Fear creates silence. Silence creates secrets, and secrets can become weapons. Isadora had attempted to control the situation by making sure that Barney and Susan knew who employed them, while the rest of the gang remained ignorant. She believed that protected her. Perhaps for a time it did, but there was another danger. She had underestimated the one man who was investigating her. Sherlock Holmes did not need everyone to know the truth. He needed only enough pieces to reconstruct it. The case therefore ended not with a dramatic police raid, but with Holmes standing quietly before Isadora Klein and explaining that her own actions had brought the matter to him. I have often thought that this was fitting. The woman had tried to solve the problem privately. Holmes had solved it privately as well, but his private solution was directed toward justice. The manuscript was gone. Douglas was gone. The past could not be restored. Nothing Holmes could do would change those facts. Yet the living could still be protected. Maberly could still be compensated, and Isadora could still be warned. That was enough. There are mysteries which end with a triumph. There are mysteries which end with a triumph. There are mysteries which end with a triumph. The Three Gables ended somewhere between the two. The truth had been found, but the truth did not undo the past. Perhaps that is why the case stayed with me. As a physician, I had often seen how difficult it was to repair an injury after the original cause had disappeared. A wound may heal, but a scar remains. Human emotions can be much the same. Douglas's grief had changed him. His writing had preserved that grief. Isadora's fear had driven her to terrible decisions. Mrs. Maberly's innocence had not protected her from suffering. Holmes could not erase any of those things. He could only bring order to what remained. And perhaps, as what a good detective does, he does not always restore the world to what was. Sometimes he merely prevents it from becoming worse. That evening, when the case had finally settled into memory, I thought again of Baker Street. I pictured the familiar room, the fire, the chairs. Holmes with his pipe. The ordinary peace of a morning before Steve Dixie burst through the door. At that moment, none of us could have known what the day would bring. A threat, a journey, an old house, a dead man's luggage, a frightened widow, a stolen manuscript, a wealthy woman, and finally, a quiet settlement. Such was the strange machinery of our adventures. The beginning was often ordinary. The ending was often unexpected, and between the two lay the patient work of observation. That, I believe, is what I remember most, not the wealth of Isadora Klein, not the violence of the burglars, not even the curious name of the house. I remember Holmes noticing what others ignored: a servant who had listened, a postmark, a trunk, a page, a pronoun, a name. One detail after another. Nothing was important by itself. Together, it became the truth. Little did I understand, on that first morning in Baker Street, how completely those small details would eventually fit together. Yet, that was Holmes's gift. He could take the scattered pieces of human behavior and place them side by side until the hidden picture appeared, and when it did, he rarely celebrated. He simply lit his pipe, leaned back, and waited for the next mystery. That was Sherlock Holmes as I knew him. And that is how, after all these years, I still remember the quiet road that led from the Three Gables to the truth. When we stepped out into Grosvenor Square, the evening air seemed to me remarkably fresh. Perhaps it was only the contrast. The drawing room of Isadora Klein had been rich, warm, and almost dreamlike. Everything within it had suggested comfort and security. Yet the conversation that had taken place there had revealed fear beneath that polished surface. Outside, London was simpler. The pavements were damp. The lamps had begun to glow. Carriages passed steadily along the street, and the wheels made that familiar rolling sound, which has always seemed to me part of the music of London. Holmes walked beside me without hurry. For some distance he said nothing. I had learned long ago not to interrupt him when he was arranging his thoughts. There were moments when his silence was more expressive than conversation. At last he turned toward me. "The case," he said, "was finished." I agreed, although I did not feel that I had completely absorbed everything that had happened. There had been so many changes in the direction of the investigation that my mind still seemed to be following the earlier stages. Only a short time before, we had been sitting in the drawing room of an elderly widow, listening to a story about an unusually generous house purchase. Now the mystery had ended in a wealthy woman's home. Between those two rooms lay a remarkable chain of events. Holmes had been threatened. Mrs. Maberly had been watched. Susan had betrayed her mistress. Douglas's luggage had arrived. The house had been entered. The manuscript had been found. And Isadora Klein had finally admitted the truth. I asked Holmes whether he had suspected her from the beginning. He gave me the sort of look which I had learned not to interpret too literally. He had not known her name when Steve Dixie arrived. He had not known the reason for the strange house offer. He had not even known that Douglas's luggage would provide the answer. What he had known was that somebody was making an extraordinary effort to keep him away. That was enough. The first mistake made by the unknown enemy had been to reveal fear. Holmes explained that the strongest clue in many investigations is not the thing a person does, but the thing that person is afraid of. If a man steals an ordinary object, one may ask why he wants it. But if he tried to prevent another person from looking at something, that tells us that the object is important. In the case of the Three Gables, the people behind the affair had practically announced that Holmes was approaching something valuable. They had not intended to do so. Yet their actions had spoken for them. I thought back to Steve Dixie. The man's appearance had been so impressive that I had initially regarded him as a possible danger. Holmes had seen otherwise. The great fist, the threatening manner, the rough speech, all of it had been surface. Steve had been employed because he was useful. He could frighten people. He could carry out orders. But he had not designed the operation. Behind him stood Barney Stockdale, and behind Barney stood someone with considerably greater resources. That progression had been the first ladder Holmes climbed. The second had been the house itself. Holmes had always possessed an extraordinary ability to read a room. Most people look at furniture and see furniture. Holmes looked at furniture and asked why it was there. Most people saw trunks in a hall. Holmes saw the timing of their arrival. Most people read a letter for its words. Holmes noticed its postmark. Most people read a manuscript for its story. Holmes noticed a change in a writer's voice. These were not dramatic talents. They were habits of attention. That, I believe, was the foundation of his success. The case had reminded me of something I had occasionally forgotten during our earlier adventures. Holmes did not always begin with a brilliant deduction. Sometimes he began with a question. Why does this agreement contain such a strange condition? Why did information travel so quickly? Why is someone watching this house? Why have these trunks arrived now? Why have the burglars searched these particular possessions? Why has this page been torn away? Why has the writer suddenly changed from describing a character to speaking as that character? Each question produced another, and each answer narrowed the field. The mystery had become almost mathematical. Yet there was nothing cold about the people involved. That was where Holmes differed from a mere puzzle solver. He knew that behind every clue was a human being. Mrs. Maberly had not been a clue. She had been a grieving mother. Douglas had not been a manuscript. He had been a young man whose emotions had overwhelmed him. Isadora had not merely been a name in society. She had been a woman, afraid that the past would destroy the future she had chosen. Even Susan and Steve, despite their criminal behavior, had their own weaknesses and fears. Holmes understood all of this. He simply did not allow sympathy to prevent him from seeing clearly. We continued through the evening streets. The traffic became thicker as we approached the center of London. The city was now fully awake. Shop windows shone beneath the lamps. People hurried home. The sounds of conversation and carriage wheels mixed together. I thought about Douglas. His story had ended before ours began. He had died in Rome. His mother had received his belongings. His manuscript had followed him home. In some sense, Douglas returned it to London only after his death, and with him came the secret that had survived him. There was something sad about that. He had written his story because he had been unable to forget. Perhaps he believed that writing would make the woman who had hurt him understand what she had done. Perhaps he simply wanted the world to know his side. Perhaps he had written because it was the only way he could express the emotions that had overwhelmed him. We could not know. The surviving page gave us only a fragment, yet Holmes had understood enough. The words had carried the emotional marks of a wounded man. The hero of the story had suffered humiliation. The woman he loved had appeared to take pleasure in it. At that moment, according to the manuscript, love had become hatred. The language was exaggerated. The emotions were intense. But they were genuine. Holmes had never been a literary critic. He had no interest in deciding whether Douglas's writing was good. A police inspector had regarded it as poor material. Holmes's concern was different. The quality of the manuscript did not matter. If London society could recognize the people behind the characters, the manuscript could become disastrous for Isadora. That was why she had been afraid. And fear, once it becomes strong enough, can make otherwise intelligent people behave foolishly. Isadora's first mistake had been to try to purchase the house. At first, that had appeared reasonable. She had offered a large sum. She had been willing to buy the furniture. If Mrs. Maberly had accepted the agreement without consulting her lawyer, the matter might have ended there. But Miss Sutro had noticed the dangerous condition. The sale had failed. Then Isadora had tried another method. Someone from within the household had become involved. Susan had communicated with Barney. The criminals had been informed. Holmes had been warned. The warning had failed. Then the burglary had taken place. The burglary had also failed. And finally, Holmes had come directly to Isadora. Each attempt to remove the problem had created another clue. That was the irony of the affair. Isadora had been trying to make the mystery disappear. Instead, she had made it larger. Holmes explained this to me in his quiet way. The criminals had not understood the danger. They believed they were searching for an object. But Holmes had been searching for the reason behind the search. That was the difference. A burglar looks for something. A detective asks why that something matters. It was a simple distinction, but separated Holmes from the men who had entered the Three Gables. They knew where to look. Holmes knew why. We had now reached a quieter street. The evening traffic had thinned. Holmes paused for a moment beneath one of the lamps. He looked toward the road ahead. The expression on his face was thoughtful rather than triumphant. I had seen him solve cases involving murder, theft, blackmail, espionage, and violence. Usually, when the answer appeared, there was some visible satisfaction. This time, there was little. Perhaps it was because the solution did not feel like a victory. There was no murderer to deliver to the police, no stolen treasure to recover, no missing person to bring home. There was only the truth of a broken relationship and the consequences that had followed it. Holmes had done what he could. Mrs. Maberly would receive compensation. Isadora would be left with a warning. The criminals would have to face the consequences of their own actions. And Douglas, of course, remained beyond all human help. That was the final boundary of detective work. Holmes could uncover the past. He could not change it. I have sometimes wondered whether that limitation ever troubled him. He rarely spoke about it. Perhaps he accepted it. It's part of the human condition. We doctors learn the same lesson. There are illnesses discovered too late. There are wounds that cannot be undone. There are people whom medicine can comfort but not save. The detective has his own version of the same truth. He can discover who caused the harm. He can protect those still living. He can sometimes secure justice, but he cannot return the clock. Holmes understood this. That may have been why he preferred action to regret. Once a matter was settled, he moved forward. There was always another problem, another door, another strange letter, another footprint in the dust, another human mystery waiting somewhere in London. We eventually reached Baker Street. The familiar house looked almost exactly as it always had. There was something comforting about that. The world outside could change. People could betray one another. Secrets could be uncovered. But Baker Street remained the same. The door, the stairs, the familiar rooms, the fireplace, the chairs, the quiet sense that another case might arrive at any moment. Inside, Holmes removed his coat. He placed his things in their usual places. Then he went to the fireplace. The fire had been left burning low. He stirred it gently. A few embers brightened. The room warmed. I took my familiar chair. For a little while, we sat in silence. I thought of the first morning of the case. Holmes had been relaxed. How distant that moment already seemed. It was strange how quickly a mystery could change the atmosphere of an ordinary day. One moment, there was nothing unusual. The next, a dangerous man stood in the room. Then came the letter, the railway journey, the Three Gables, Mrs. Mabberley, Susan, the trunks, the burglary, the manuscript, Isadora. And now this quiet room again. It was almost as though the case had closed a circle. Holmes reached for his pipe. He filled it slowly. I watched the familiar movements. There was something reassuring in them. Whatever had happened, my friend was himself again. He had no need to boast about the solution. He rarely did. He simply smoked. I remember thinking then that this was one of the reasons I enjoyed our life together. The mysteries were often dramatic. The aftermath was frequently quiet. And between the two was the companionship of Baker Street. There were long evenings when Holmes read. There were mornings when we discussed some new case. There were meals interrupted by telegrams. There were nights when London seemed endless outside the window. And there were peaceful periods when nothing happened at all. The Three Gables belonged to the memories between those moments. I asked Holmes whether he believed Isadora had been sincere when she claimed that she regretted what had happened to Douglas. He considered the question. He did not offer an easy answer. Human beings could feel regret and still behave badly. They could love someone and hurt them. They could recognize their mistakes only after the consequences had become unavoidable. Isadora might genuinely have regretted the way Douglas had been treated. That did not excuse what she had done afterward. This was another lesson in which Holmes was more subtle than people sometimes realize. He did not need to decide that someone was completely good or completely evil. He was interested in actions. Isadora had made choices. Those choices caused harm. She had to accept the consequences. At the same time, she was not required to become a monster in Holmes' eyes. She was simply a human being who had allowed fear and self-interest to lead her too far. That was enough. The fire settled again. Outside, the sounds of London became quieter. I found myself thinking about the old house at Harrow Weald. The Three Gables would probably continue to stand. People might eventually forget the burglary. New tenants might occupy the rooms. The grove of young pines would grow taller. The garden would change. The house itself would remain. Yet for Mrs. Maberly, I hoped its memory would fade. A home should be a place of rest. For a short time, hers had become a place of fear. That was perhaps the greatest injustice in the affair. The criminals had not merely searched property. They had invaded a private life. They had entered a bedroom at night. They had frightened an elderly woman, all because of words written by her dead son. It was difficult to think of anything more unnecessary. Holmes had understood that. Perhaps that was why he had been particularly determined to see that she received something from the affair. Not revenge, not publicity, freedom, a chance to leave, a chance to travel, a chance to replace the memory of the Three Gables with other memories. I found the thought comforting. Holmes's solution had not restored the past, but it had given the future a little more room. That is sometimes the best one can do. Years later, now I look back upon our cases, I am often struck by how little of them depended upon dramatic moments. The public likes dramatic moments. The public imagines detectives breaking down doors and confronting villains, but the real work is usually quieter. A question, an observation, a contradiction, a remembered name, a small piece of paper. The right question asked at the right time. Holmes knew this. His greatest weapon was not his strength. It was not even his intelligence in the abstract. It was his attention. He paid attention longer than other people did. He noticed things other people dismissed. He remembered things other people forgot. And he was willing to change his theory when the evidence required it. The combination was extraordinarily powerful. The Three Gables was a perfect example. Nothing about the beginning suggested the ending. A house sale, a threatening visitor, a servant, a retired sea captain, a dead diplomat, a few traveling trunks, a manuscript, a wealthy woman. Taken separately, these were ordinary fragments. Together, they told one story, the story of Douglas Maberly, the story of Isadora Klein, and the story of a secret which one person had tried desperately to destroy. Holmes had found that story without ever possessing the complete manuscript. He had needed only a fragment. That was perhaps the final demonstration of his method. He did not require all the information. He required enough information. Once he had enough, the missing pieces could be inferred. That was why his conclusions sometimes seemed almost magical. They were not. They were built patiently from evidence. The magic was in the patience. The magic was in the discipline. The magic was in refusing to ignore the small thing. I sat quietly beside him that evening. The fire burned. The smoke from his pipe drifted upward. The house was peaceful. No footsteps came up the stairs. No telegram arrived. No visitor knocked. For the first time since the case began, the Three Gables felt truly distant. I was glad of it. Some mysteries are best remembered from a comfortable chair. The danger has passed. The facts are settled, and the mind is free to consider what they meant. Holmes finally broke the silence. He remarked, almost casually, that human nature was a strange thing. I could not disagree. A woman with enormous wealth had been frightened by the words of a dead man. A young man had turned heartbreak into a manuscript. A servant had betrayed her employer for money. A group of criminals had risked imprisonment because they had been paid. An elderly mother had been caught between them all, and one detective had followed the thread. It was a strange collection of people. Yet perhaps very one of them had acted from motives that seemed reasonable to themselves. That is what makes human mysteries so difficult. People rarely believe themselves to be villains. They tell themselves stories. They justify their choices. They believe that circumstances forced their hand. Sometimes they are partly right. Sometimes they are completely wrong. The detective must stand outside those private explanations. He must the consequences. Holmes had done so, and now the matter was finished. The next morning would bring another day. London would continue. People would wake. Carriages would move. The newspapers would carry fresh stories. Somewhere, another person would be making a decision which might eventually create mystery. For that evening, Baker Street was quiet. The case, the Three Gables, had ended. And as I listened to the soft crackle of the fire, I realized that I was grateful, not merely for the solution, but for the calm which followed it. There is a peculiar comfort in knowing that a tangled matter has finally been entangled. The threads lie separately. The knots are gone. The mind can rest. So we sat there, Holmes and I, beside the fire. Outside, London slowly settled into night, and for a while there was nothing more to investigate. There are occasions when a case is solved, yet the mind continues to return to it. The facts may have been arranged, the names may have been identified, the motives may have been understood, and still some quiet question remains. I experienced that feeling after the affair of the Three Gables. The immediate danger had passed. Holmes had secured compensation from Maberly, and the woman who had set the whole affair in motion had been confronted with the consequences of her actions. Yet, I found myself thinking about the people involved. Perhaps it was because the case began with such an ordinary thing, a house that an elderly widow wished to sell. There was nothing mysterious about wanting to sell a house. There was nothing mysterious about wishing to travel. There was nothing mysterious about receiving an attractive offer. The mystery began only when the offer became too generous, and the conditions became too strange. That was where Holmes had entered the story. I remember how easily I had accepted the surface explanation. A wealthy client wanted a particular house. The owner had been offered a good price. Perhaps it was simply a fortunate opportunity. But Holmes had not been satisfied. He had asked the questions which ordinary people often neglect. Why this house? Why all the furniture? Why must nothing leave the building unchecked? Why now? And most importantly, what had recently entered the house? Those questions had eventually led us to Douglas Maberly's luggage. The answer had traveled quietly from Italy. There had been no announcement. No one had told us that the luggage was important. It simply arrived. Yet, timing made it important. The trunks had reached the Three Gables only shortly before the mysterious buyer appeared. That was enough for Holmes. He had not needed certainty. He needed a direction. And once he had that direction, the investigation became much clearer. I sometimes wonder how different the case would have been if Mrs. Maberly had unpacked those trunks immediately. Perhaps the manuscript would have been discovered. Perhaps she would have understood its importance. Perhaps the criminals would have acted sooner. Perhaps Holmes would have been given the answer before the burglary occurred. But human affairs rarely follow convenient paths. The trunks remained unopened. That gave the people behind the affair their opportunity. They believed the secret was still hidden. They believed that they could reach it before anyone else understood what it meant. They were mistaken. The burglary was their great error. Before the break-in, Holmes knew only that something important was hidden in the house. After the break-in, he knew exactly where the criminals had looked. Their behavior told him more than they realized. A burglar who searches a room carefully reveals his purpose. A burglar who ignores valuables and goes directly to one person's belongings is revealing something even more useful. The criminals had searched Douglas's effects. That fact could not be explained away. They were not ordinary thieves. They had not entered the house merely for money. They had come for something connected with Douglas, and the surviving page confirmed it. I remember the inspector's reaction. He had regarded the sheet almost as a joke. To him, it appeared to be a fragment of an inferior novel. The page was crumpled. The writing was emotional. The subject was melodramatic. There was no obvious commercial value. The inspector therefore assumed that the burglars had simply taken whatever happened to be nearby. Holmes did not make that assumption. He examined the page. He noticed the number, 245. That meant there had been hundreds of pages before it. Where were they? The question was simple. The answer was troubling. The rest of the manuscript had been removed. The burglars had taken it. The page had remained only because Mrs. Maberly had managed to tear it from one of the men during the struggle. A single sheet had escaped, and that single sheet was enough. Holmes read the passage carefully. The writing described humiliation and heartbreak. The man in the story had suffered at the hands of a woman he loved. At first, writer described him from a distance. Then the language changed. The writer ceased to speak of the hero as someone else. He became the hero. That small change revealed the emotional truth. The manuscript was personal. Douglas had written about himself. He had disguised the people involved, but he had not been able to disguise his own feelings. The more Holmes considered it, the more obvious the danger became. The manuscript was not merely a private document. It could become a public scandal, and the woman at its center had everything to lose: her wealth, her position, her future marriage, her carefully protected reputation. That was why the manuscript had become more valuable than the house itself. The Three Gables had only been a container. The real object was the story. And the real reason for the strange purchase was the fear of that story being read. There is a curious power in written words. A person may die, a house may be sold, a friendship may disappear, but words can remain. They can travel farther than the person who wrote them. They can reach strangers. They can survive generations. Douglas had died in Rome, yet his anger had returned to England in the form of his manuscript. It had arrived among his luggage. His mother had not known what she possessed. Isadora Klein knew. That difference explained everything. Mrs. Maberly saw a dead son's belongings. Isadora saw a threat. Holmes saw a clue. Three people could look at the same object and see three completely different things. That is one of the strange features of human life. Objects have no meaning by themselves. We give them meaning. To Mrs. Maberly, the trunks were memories. To the criminals, they were a target. To Isadora, they contained danger. To Holmes, they contained information. I found myself thinking about Douglas as well. His mother had described him to us with such affection. She remembered the young man she had known before the affair changed him. He had been energetic. He had been charming. He had possessed an almost excessive vitality. He lived intensely. Then something happened. His personality altered. The cheerful young man became bitter and withdrawn. His mother watched the change. She had seen her son suffer without fully understanding how deeply the experience had affected him. Perhaps the manuscript was the final expression of that suffering. Writing may have been Douglas's attempt to preserve his own version of events. He had not accepted silence. He wanted his story to survive. That desire was understandable. But the manner in which he expressed it carried its own danger. A public accusation can hurt more than a private quarrel. A name may be concealed, but people who know the circumstances can often recognize themselves. Isadora had understood this. That was why she had been desperate to find the second copy. She knew there were two. One had been sent to her. The other had been intended for the publisher. She investigated whether the publisher had received it. When she learned that he had not, she understood that the second copy might still be somewhere among Douglas's possessions. Then Douglas died. His belongings would return to his mother. The danger moved with them. That was the moment when the quiet house in Harrow became important. The manuscript was traveling toward it, and Isadora's fear traveled in the opposite direction. She sent people after it. First came the attempt to purchase the property. It was an elegant solution. No violence, no obvious crime, simply money, an enormous amount of money. If Miss Maberly had accepted, Isadora could have acquired the house and everything inside it. The manuscript would have become hers. The problem would have disappeared. But the strange agreement demanded much. Mrs. Maberly would have been unable to remove even her personal possessions without inspection. Her lawyer noticed the danger. The arrangement collapsed. The second method was less respectable. The criminals were brought into the matter. Servant within the household became part of the operation. Information passed from Susan to Barney. Barney received instructions. Steve Dixie came to Baker Street. Holmes was warned. The warning failed. That failure was important. Isadora had believed that fear could make Holmes stop. She had misunderstood him. Holmes was not offended by danger. He was interested in it. If someone considered it necessary to threaten him, then the investigation must be worth pursuing. The threat had therefore achieved precisely the opposite of what was intended. Instead of abandoning the case, Holmes became more determined. And once he began investigating, the criminal operation began to unravel. The burglary was the next stage. Mrs. Maberly had been advised to obtain protection. She did not wish to trouble Mr. Suttrow. That decision left her vulnerable. The criminals entered during the night. The chloroform rendered her helpless. They searched Douglas's belongings. Mrs. Maberly fought back. For a brief moment, she managed to seize one of the men. Then she was overcome. Her young maid raised the alarm. The police arrived. The burglars escaped. But they had left behind the most important clue of all. They had shown exactly what they wanted. The manuscript. That was enough for Holmes. Once he knew what they were seeking, he only had to discover why. Langdale Pikes supplied the final connection. The name Isadora Klein transformed the case. She had been one of the most celebrated women in society. She had wealth enough to act without restraint. She had a history with Douglas, and she was preparing to marry. The manuscript threatened that future. There was no longer any mystery about motive, only the question of what Holmes would do with it. That question became especially interesting to me because Holmes was not a conventional detective. He had no desire to turn every case into a spectacle. He wanted the truth. Once he had the truth, he considered what should be done with it. That was why the final meeting with Isadora was so important. He did not approach her like a policeman. He approached her like a man who already understood what she had done. His calmness forced her to make the first move. At first, she denied everything. Then Holmes indicated that he would go to the police. Her attitude changed. She became cooperative. She tried to appeal to his sense of honor. She reminded him that the matter involved a woman's private secret. Holmes listened, but he did not permit the language of privacy to hide the consequences for her actions. A secret may belong to one person, but the actions taken to protect that secret may harm other people. That was the important distinction. Isadora had not merely kept a private secret. She had employed criminals. She had threatened Holmes. She had caused Mrs. Maberly to be attacked. She had sent people into another person's home. Privacy could not excuse all of that. Then Holmes demanded the manuscript. Isadora showed him what remained. The ashes. She had burned it. At first glance, that might have seemed like a victory for her. The document was gone. The evidence had disappeared. But Holmes understood that destroying the manuscript did not destroy the truth. By burning it in his presence, she had confirmed how much it mattered. The act itself became evidence. She had revealed what she had been trying to hide. The fire could destroy paper. It could not destroy the events which had produced the paper. It could not erase Douglas's feelings. It could not erase the memory of the relationship. It could not erase the people who had been involved. And it certainly could not erase what Holmes now knew. The case, therefore, reached a curious point. The physical object had vanished, but the mystery had not. The truth had survived the destruction of the evidence. Perhaps that was the deepest lesson of the affair. People often believe that if they can destroy a letter, burn a document, remove a photograph, or silence a witness, the past itself will disappear. It rarely does. The past survives in memory. It survives in behavior. It survives in the consequences of earlier actions. And sometimes it survives in the mind of a man like Sherlock Holmes. He had seen enough. There was no need for the entire manuscript. There was no need for every page. The surviving fragment had told him what kind of document it was. The criminal's behavior had told him where it was. The timing had told him why it had become important. The connection with Isadora had told him who wanted it. And her own actions had confirmed the conclusion. That was sufficient. The mystery was solved. The paper was no longer necessary. This was something I had learned from Holmes over the years. Evidence does not always need to survive physically once its meaning has been understood. A footprint may disappear in rain. A letter may burn. A witness may forget. But if the investigator has already understood what those things meant, the loss does not necessarily destroy the case. Holmes's mind had preserved what the fire had destroyed. The £5,000 came afterward. It was not a reward. It was compensation. Mrs. Maberly, been caught in the affair through no fault of her own. Holmes remembered her wish to travel. The amount would allow her to fulfill it. There was something deeply satisfying about that decision. The people who had caused trouble wanted to control the future. Holmes gave the innocent woman a chance to choose her own. That is why I have never thought of the ending as merely a bargain. It was a quiet restoration of freedom. Maberly had entered the case as a woman trapped by circumstances. She could leave it as a woman with new possibilities. She had lost the peace at her home for a time. Perhaps she could now gain something more valuable. Distance, travel, new places, new memories, a different life. I like to think that she took that opportunity. Perhaps she traveled south toward warmer countries. Perhaps she crossed the Mediterranean. Perhaps she stood upon a deck and watched the English coast disappear into the distance. There are many places she might have seen: Cairo, Madeira, the Riviera, or perhaps she followed the dream further and traveled around the world. Holmes had asked her about those places deliberately. He knew that the dream existed. He simply needed to turn it into a practical possibility. And so the case ended not with the punishment of a villain, but with the opening of a door for someone who had suffered. That was very much in keeping with Holmes. He could be severe. He could be sarcastic. He could be almost painfully direct. But when circumstances allowed it, he preferred to leave the world a little better than he had found it. The evening deepened outside Baker Street. The fire had burned lower. Holmes sat opposite me. The room was warm and quiet. I found myself thinking that perhaps the case had contained another lesson. People are often most dangerous when they are trying desperately to preserve an image of themselves. Isadora had feared scandal. She wanted the world to see her as she wished to be seen. The manuscript threatened that image, so she tried to control the story. But in attempting to control the story, she created another one, the story of the Three Gables. That story was not written by Douglas. It was written by events. A threatening visitor, a frightened widow, a servant's betrayal, a night burglary, a surviving page, a meeting in a luxurious drawing room, and a detective who noticed everything. The manuscript may have disappeared into the fire, but the greater story remained. Holmes had understood this, and perhaps that was why he had not been troubled by its destruction. The important story was already in his possession. The fire had merely removed the object. It had not removed the truth. I looked toward Holmes. He was reading quietly. His face was calm. There was no sign of triumph, no excitement, no desire to discuss the matter further. For him, it was another problem completed. For me, it had become another memory. And as the years passed, that memory grew softer. The frightening moments became less frightening. The strange house became more picturesque. The old trunks became symbols of a forgotten life. The manuscript became a ghost of something that had once existed, and Holmes himself became, in my memory, exactly as he had been that evening. Quiet beside the fire, patient, thoughtful, completely at ease now that the mystery had been resolved. The city outside continued to move. London never truly slept. Yet Baker Street had become peaceful again. There would be other mornings, other visitors, other cases. But for that night, there was nothing left to pursue. The Three Gables had yielded its secret. And the last traces of the affair were settling gently into memory. Little did I know that years later, I would still remember the case not for the threats or the burglary, but for the strange journey by which a few small clues had revealed an entire hidden life. The house had been ordinary. The people were not. The mystery had been quiet. The consequences were not. And the solution, as so often with Holmes, had been waiting patiently inside details that almost everyone else had overlooked. The matter might have ended there, and in the ordinary course of events, I believe that it would have done so. Yet there was one final aspect of the affair which remained in my mind long after we had left Isadora Klein's house. It concerned the warning Holmes had given her. He had obtained what he wanted. Maberly would receive the money she needed to travel. The danger to her had passed. The manuscript itself had been destroyed. There was therefore little practical reason for Holmes to continue arguing with Isadora. But Holmes was not satisfied merely to close a case. He wished the woman to understand what she had risked. She had placed herself in the hands of criminals. Barney Stockdale and his associates might have appeared useful while they were being paid. But men who live by intimidation do not always remain obedient. Today, they may work for a wealthy employer. Tomorrow, they may discover that the knowledge they possess is worth more than the wages they receive. Holmes knew this. He had seen too many criminal arrangements collapse from within. A secret shared with dishonest people is never completely safe. Isadora had believed that she had protected herself by keeping her identity concealed from most of the gang. Only Barney and Susan, she claimed, knew who stood behind the operation. That might have seemed a clever precaution, but Holmes understood that it was also weakness. Barney knew, Susan knew, and now Holmes knew. The police were already interested in the burglary. The criminals therefore had every reason to fear for themselves. If one of them was arrested and decided to speak, the carefully protected secret might no longer remain secret. Holmes warned Isidora of this without raising his voice. There was no need for drama. His meaning was plain. She could not continue playing with dangerous people forever without eventually being harmed by the same methods she had employed against others. The warning was almost more memorable than the threat of police action. Holmes was giving her an opportunity. He had discovered what she had done. He had forced her to compensate Mrs. Mabberley. But he was also telling her to stop. There would be no need for another meeting. She behaved wisely. I have sometimes thought that this was characteristic of Holmes at his best. He was capable of great severity when circumstances demanded it. But he did not seek punishment simply because punishment was available. He wanted the danger to end. That was the important point. The elderly Mrs. Mabberley had already suffered enough. Douglas was beyond the reach of any justice we could provide. The manuscript had disappeared. There was nothing to be gained by prolonging the affair. Holmes therefore chose the quietest ending available. He turned the wealth of the guilty party into an opportunity for the innocent one. £5,000 was not an insignificant sum. For Mrs. Mabberley, it could mean a new beginning. I remembered the way she had spoken when Holmes first asked where she would like to travel. She had answered almost wistfully. She had always wanted to see the world. It was a simple desire, yet one which she had never been able to fulfill. Her life had been tied to the house. Then the strange offer had appeared. For a brief time she believed that fortune had finally offered her the freedom she wanted. Instead, the offer had brought danger. Now, strangely enough, the same affair might finally give her what she had desired. That seemed fitting. The house had been the source of her trouble. It need not remain the center of her life. She could leave it behind. She could travel. She could see places she had only imagined, and perhaps, with time, the memory of the night burglary would become less sharp. Perhaps the image of the Three Gables would eventually be replaced by other scenes. A distant coastline, a foreign city, a warm evening, beside another sea. A railway journey through unfamiliar country. I like to imagine that after her, it was the gentlest ending the circumstances permitted. As for Douglas Mabberley, there was little more that could be said. His life had ended before the mystery began. His mother had described him as a man of extraordinary vitality. Holmes had remembered him in much the same way, but the affair with Isidora had changed him. The manuscript showed how deeply. It was easy to judge the bitterness of his writing. The surviving page was certainly full of wounded feeling, yet I could not help seeing the young man behind the words. He had loved, he had hoped, he had been rejected, he had suffered humiliation, and he had tried to give his suffering a permanent form through writing. Perhaps he had believed that the manuscript would force Isidora to understand him. Perhaps he simply wanted his version of events to survive. Whatever his intention, his words had outlived him. They had crossed the sea with his belongings. They had reached his mother's house. And they had frightened the woman who had once been the center of his life. There was something melancholy about that. A dead man's private emotions had become a danger to the living. And in trying to destroy those emotions, others had created still more suffering. It was a chain which Holmes had finally broken. The case also left me thinking about the difference between justice and revenge. Douglas had written of revenge. Isidora had acted from fear of exposure. The criminals had acted for money. Each had been responding to some immediate desire. Holmes had stood outside all of that. He had not taken Douglas's side merely because Douglas was dead. Nor had he excused Isidora because she was wealthy or because she regretted what had happened. He had examined what each person had done. Then he had acted upon the facts. That was the strength of his judgment. He could understand motives without allowing them to excuse consequences. When we returned to Baker Street, the ordinary quiet of our rooms seemed particularly welcome. The fire was burning gently. The chairs stood where we had left them. The familiar smell of tobacco lingered in the room. London moved beyond the windows, but the sounds were softened by distance. Holmes settled into his chair. For once, there was no need for further investigation. The case was finished. I found myself thinking of how differently it had begun. A huge man had entered our rooms. He had tried to frighten Holmes. His warning had led us to a quiet house. That house had led us to an old woman. The old woman's story had led us to her son's luggage. The luggage had led us to a manuscript. The manuscript had led us to a woman of immense wealth, and that woman had finally led us back to the simple truth. A secret may be hidden for years, but when someone becomes desperate enough to protect it, the effort to conceal it may reveal more than the secret itself. Holmes had understood that from the beginning. I had needed the whole journey to understand it. Perhaps that was why I remembered the case. It was not simply a story of crime. It was a story of consequences. One decision had led to another. One act of pride had led to another act of fear. One attempt at concealment had produced another, until eventually the whole chain had reached Baker Street. And there, beside the fire, Sherlock Holmes had patiently followed it back to its beginning. That evening, however, there was nothing left to follow. The Three Gables had finally become what it had always appeared to be from the outside: an ordinary house, a quiet house, a house which had briefly held a secret far more valuable and far more dangerous than anything its owner had ever expected to possess. The case was over, and for the first time in several days, we could simply sit beside the fire and allow London to continue without us. As I look back now, after so many years, I find that the cases which remain most clearly in my memory are not always those involving the greatest danger. Sometimes it is the quieter cases which stay with us. The adventure of the Three Gables was one of them. There had been no great treasure to recover. No elaborate conspiracy had threatened the whole country. No criminal genius had challenged Holmes across London. Instead, there had been an elderly woman, a dead son, a house, and a manuscript. Yet, from those simple things came a remarkable chain of events. It began with a strange offer for a house. It continued with a threat at Baker Street. Led us to Harrow Weald, where Holmes noticed the things which others had overlooked. A servant had passed information to criminals. The gang had been employed. Douglas Maberly's trunks had arrived from Italy. The house had been watched. Then, during the night, intruders had entered. They had searched the dead man's belongings. And from among those belongings came the fragment which revealed the true nature of the mystery. Holmes had followed each clue patiently. He had never needed to know everything at once. One fact had led to another. The house had led to the luggage. The luggage had led to the manuscript. The manuscript had led to Douglas. Douglas had led to Isadora Klein. And Isadora's own actions had finally confirmed what Holmes had already understood. That was the brilliance of my old friend. He could look at something apparently insignificant and ask the one question which gave it meaning: a postmark, a trunk, a servant's nervous expression, a page of writing, a change in a single pronoun. To most people, such things were nothing. To Holmes, they were pieces of a larger design. The case also taught me something about the danger of trying too hard to bury the past. Isadora had possessed wealth enough to purchase almost anything. She had tried to use that wealth to obtain the house and everything within it. When that failed, she had turned to people willing to use force. The more she tried to suppress the manuscript, the more evidence she created. In the end, the manuscript itself was destroyed, but its destruction could not erase what Holmes had learned. The past had already spoken, and Holmes had listened. I remember Mrs. Mabberley most warmly. She had entered the case simply as a mother who had lost her son. She had not understood why strangers wanted her home. She had not known what lay among Douglas's possessions. She had certainly never expected that those possessions would place her in danger. Yet Holmes remembered something very simple about her. She wanted to travel. That small dream became part of his solution. The £5,000 provided by Isadora would allow her to leave the Three Gables and see something of the world. I like to think that she did exactly that. Perhaps she stood aboard a ship and watched the gray English coast fade behind her. Perhaps she saw distant cities, unfamiliar landscapes, and warm seas. Perhaps she discovered that the world was much larger than the unhappy events which had occupied those few weeks of her life. If so, then the case had given her something beyond compensation. It had given her a new chapter, and perhaps that was the greatest kindness Holmes could offer. As for Isadora Klein, I have never thought of her as a simple villain. She had done wrong. That cannot be denied. She had allowed fear and pride to carry her into actions which endangered an innocent woman. But Holmes understood that human beings are rarely simple. People make choices. Then they make further choices to protect the first. Soon they find themselves far from the person they originally intended to be. Isadora had tried to protect her reputation. Then she had tried to protect herself from the consequences of that effort. One action had required another. The chain had grown. Holmes finally broke it. He did so without unnecessary cruelty. He demanded compensation. He gave a warning, and he allowed the matter to end. That was enough. Douglas, of course, remained the saddest figure in the story. I never knew him well, but I knew what his mother had seen. A brilliant and energetic young man had become bitter and withdrawn. Whatever his faults, he had suffered. His manuscript had been an attempt to give form to that suffering. Perhaps it was not a perfect response. Perhaps it was not a wise one. But it was human. The pages were gone now. Only a fragment had survived long enough to reach Holmes's hands. Yet even that fragment had been enough. And so, in a strange way, Douglas's final words had accomplished something. They had revealed the truth. They had brought Holmes to the woman he had written about, and they had ultimately brought protection and freedom to his mother. That is a strange legacy for a dead man's manuscript. But life is full of such strange endings. The fire in Baker Street had burned low by the time our thoughts turned away from the case. The room was warm. The London streets outside had grown quiet. Holmes sat in his familiar chair, his pipe between his fingers. I watched the smoke drift slowly upward. There was no need for further conversation. The mystery was finished. The danger had passed. The Three Gables had become another memory among the many which filled our years together. I knew even then that another case would eventually arrive. There would be another knock at the door, another letter, another strange visitor, another problem which seemed impossible until Holmes began asking his questions. That was the rhythm of our life. Mystery, investigation, deduction, resolution. Then, for a little while, peace. I have often been grateful for those quiet intervals. They gave us time to sit beside the fire and remember that London was not made entirely of crime and mystery. There were ordinary evenings, ordinary meals, ordinary conversations, and sometimes there was nothing at all. Perhaps that is why those moments remain so precious. Holmes was famous for his deductions, but I remember him just as clearly in silence. The man beside the fire, the pipe, the thoughtful expression, the calm after the storm. That is the Sherlock Holmes I carried with me through the years. The case of the Three Gables had shown once again that brilliance does not always announce itself with a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is simply the ability to notice what everyone else has ignored. Sometimes justice does not arrive with handcuffs and a courtroom. Sometimes it comes quietly in the form of compensation, protection, and a chance to begin again. And sometimes a mystery does not end by restoring the past. It ends by allowing the living to move beyond it. That, I think, was what Holmes achieved for Mrs. Moberly. She could leave the house. She could travel. She could remember her son without allowing the strange events surrounding his manuscript to define the rest of her life. And perhaps that was enough. The fire had almost gone out. I rose and added another piece of coal. For a moment, the flames brightened the room. Then they settled again into a gentle glow. Outside, London continued beneath night sky. Somewhere beyond our windows, people were sleeping. Some were beginning their journeys. Some were returning home. And somewhere, perhaps, another mystery was quietly beginning. But that was for another day. For now, the Three Gables was behind us. The house, the manuscript, the strange bargain, the criminals, the wealthy woman, the grieving mother. All had become part of the past. What remained was the lesson. Look carefully. Listen patiently. Do not mistake appearances for truth. And never forget that the smallest detail may carry the greatest meaning. These were lessons Holmes had taught me again and again. They were lessons I carried long after our adventures in Baker Street had ended. And so, my dear friend, if you have remained with me through this quiet recollection, I hope that the old streets of London, the soft firelight, and the curious mystery of Three Gables have made pleasant company for you tonight. The night is deep now. The streets are quiet. The fire is fading. And the old memories can finally rest. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.